So what we're doing today is we're taking a break from the moral philosophy stuff, and we're going to review a new video from Kraut, who is a YouTuber that we're a fan of, and he does video essays on political theory and current events and stuff. So he's just put out a video on realism in foreign policy, which, to the best of my understanding, this is some like largely associated with like Henry Kissinger's foreign policy. Do I have that pretty much right?
Yeah, it's a critique of sort of the idea of realism, which I believe Henry Kissinger is a proponent of. Probably more famously and much more contemporary, with all the Ukraine-Russia stuff going on, would be Mearsheimer is often quoted by people that tend to align more against the efforts to support Ukraine. If I'm being charitable to them, the general idea. Well, I guess I probably shouldn't get into it, but yeah, basically it's the ideology of Mearsheimer, Kissinger, and many others.
Okay. This is a pretty long video that we're going to review. Did you want to do the whole thing today, or would you rather split it up and just do half?
No, we can see how we go, but I think we probably get through it.
Okay. So then I'm ready whenever you are.
This video is a critique of the foreign policy school of realism, which recently got a lot of attention in the news media because of the war in Ukraine. Many prominent realists, such as John Mearsheimer and Henry Kissinger, have been giving talks and writing articles since then advocating for an end of Western support for Ukraine. The injection of political opinions in the news is something we're increasingly aware of, but it can be difficult to navigate, which is why I'm a big fan of Ground News. This website and app gathers related articles from thousands of sources in one place and provides context about the sources. On the homepage, you'll see a wide variety of news stories, but what's unique is every story is accompanied by graphs and analysis to show you the political bias, reliability, and ownership of the sources reporting. There are many news stories on Ground News that are an interesting read as an addendum to this video. For example, if you search for Henry Kissinger on Ground News, you will get a list of all the news outlets reporting on Kissinger's calls for negotiations with Russia from 2 months ago. And then you can go through the tabs left, center, and right to see how outlets of different political bias cover and comment on what Kissinger has recently been saying. Interesting here is that Kissinger recently changed his position and now argues for a NATO membership of Ukraine. And you can now again see how different outlets of different bias report this change of mind. I have used Ground News for half a year now, and by far my favorite feature is their Chrome extension, which pops up whenever I'm reading an article to conveniently show me who else is reporting on it and what the bias distribution is. Then I can just click through and read multiple perspectives on the topic in one place. Ground News is especially useful if you follow a lot of political news, and if you are interested in how political biases impact reporting on news. But it is also useful if you wish to be aware of your own biases and consider opposing viewpoints with an open mind. If you're someone like that, you are able to use Ground News specifically to seek out reporting and articles that you disagree with, to honestly challenge your own biases and escape a potential information bubble. If you want to sign up for Ground News yourself, go to ground.news/Kraut or use the link in the description. As a frequent user of the platform, I'm confident in recommending it to you and grateful for their continued sponsorship of this channel. Hello, hey. A lot of you liked this video that I made a while ago, and you asked me to make another one like it. There's a video that a lot of you requested for a very long time. Speaking realism, Mearsheimer and Chomsky. Here you go, this is it, but it's a bit of a longer one, so get comfortable. When Russia invaded Ukraine, many people began sharing clips of John Mearsheimer, in particular far-left pundits who are critical of an interventionist American foreign policy, which is somewhat funny, but more on that later. Mearsheimer argues in these clips that the fault of the war in Ukraine lies with the Americans for creating an existential threat for Russia by advancing the borders of NATO. Mearsheimer has also been invited to several discussions after the Russian invasion to speak. Mearsheimer is a realist, and it is important to outline here what realism is. I will try to do so objectively, but you are free to point out in the comments if I fail at that. Realism is not an idealistic position or a set of ideological beliefs. Realism is something completely different. Realism is a school of international studies in which people attempt to create a system of analysis that allows for predictive models of analysis of geopolitical developments, despite one's biases. It strives to create an objective framework from which to interpret geopolitics. And although I will argue against this claim to objectivity, I will present realism as faithfully as I can. Realism is a method of seeing and analyzing geopolitics, and not something driven out of any sort of idealism or higher-minded morality. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Realism seeks to ground itself through three guiding principles: that men are self-interested and power-seeking, and therefore that ethics and what ought to be are not good tools to make or predict state policy, and that their natural condition is a state of anarchy.
Can we pause for a second?
In many ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah.
I find it really strange to describe this as like not idealistic or not ideological, right? And then they just immediately go into like, here are some generalizing principles that were serving as a foundation for this school of thought. I mean, how is this not ideological?
Yeah, it is. I don't know. Well, it is and it isn't. I think it's ideological, but in a way that's still it is ideological when you really get down to like its fundamentals, but I think you can distinguish it as a tool of analysis that relies on some ideological assumptions, as opposed to like, the more like manifestly ideological stuff like, oh, government, big government bad, or big government good, stuff like that. It's I think the best way that I've always heard these sorts of schools of thought described is, you should view these as lenses that may or may not provide you usefulness when it comes to trying to understand a situation. When it comes to things like theories of international relations, or theories of anything, right? Like feminism is just a lens by which you can analyze things. And if that seems to reveal additional truth or things that are useful to you, then by all means use it. But I think that some people get really lost, like wholeheartedly endorsing, like, oh, well, I am a capital R realist, or I am a, capital F feminist. I think that those, it's not necessarily bad to say that, but I think it can sometimes get you a little lost in the sauce, because these are still these are systems of analysis that are still built on ideological assumptions.
Yeah. So I guess what it seems like what it's trying to do, I do think it's ideological. I think we agree on that. But yeah. I think it's descriptively ideological, and it's just trying to provide a lens for descriptive analysis in a way that leaves room for different prescriptive follow-ups. Maybe that's fair?
Huh. Could you go over that one more time? I'm not sure if I understand exactly.
Yeah. So it's I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's more of a descriptive framework rather than a prescriptive framework, is kind of what I'm expecting it to say. And so, which is
still ideological, but but it is distinct.
Right. And so, but somebody could adopt the same descriptive framework and apply different prescriptions to it, right? And like this is like, I guess the point of these ideological assumptions is just to help you understand the world in a certain way, and then you can like apply whatever moral values you have to that understanding, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's almost like I don't know how familiar you are with sort of the idea of like the philosophy of science, but I think it's almost similar to that, where you are trying to do things, the actions you're taking ostensibly aren't like biased, but they rely on assumptions that do carry some sort of bias. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, right? So you might say, well, science is just trying to get the truth. Well, it's like, but hold on. In a way, even the idea that we ought be looking for a deeper understanding of the universe to enhance our living, that in and of itself is still an ideological position, right? So, right, that you can't ever come to these ought conclusions without, engaging in some level of bias.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the science thing, because that made me think, like, okay, when you do these kind of philosophy of science analysis, I think you've got to do it with the understanding that people are going to behave accordingly in a certain way, because even though a certain understanding of science doesn't technically require certain behaviors or prescriptions to follow from it, we do know that there is a culture of science that exists in such a way that we can more or less predict how people are going to react or respond to these ideas, right? I think just given these precepts that are on the screen here, I think it applies even more to realism than it does to philosophy of science, because the very first one says men are self-interested and seek power. So I think, like, someone who believes these things, who just takes them at face value, is going to think like, okay, we're providing a descriptive framework, kind of, or a lens of analysis that to help you understand a descriptive framework, however you want to put that. But then and even though it is not explicitly prescriptive, it is still predictably going to lead to certain prescriptions if it is true, because people who are self-interested and seek power are going to use this framework to pursue their self-interest and to seek power, right?
Yeah, it's it's it, it's really frustrating sometimes, because a lot of these frameworks or lenses are useful, but it feels like people always take them way too far, where people absolutely are self-interested and seek power oftentimes, right? Maybe even most of the time. But there's still a significant amount of time where people act in a way that, doesn't represent self-interest, or the ways in which people think they will be acting in self-interest are actually self-detrimental. So yeah, it's really in the application of these sort of ideas that I think you can really run into problems, because it's not as if realism is a totally, I think, bankrupt ideology or means of analysis of international relations. I mean, most famously, maybe some people who are more historically literate than me are going to blow me up for this, but the not the Treaty of Versailles, but the Congress of Vienna, I believe it is, that sort of brokered the peace that lasted after the Napoleonic Wars right up until World War One, sort of the lack of great power conflicts, was very much based off of the premise of realism, of establishing a balance of power between the great powers so that there couldn't be any conflict. And that was, for the most part, largely successful. So it's not as if it's, totally worthless, but it just feels like the application is where you sort of run into problem. It feels like people take this without caveats, and there's almost no means of analysis when it comes to, something that's complex international relations that isn't going to be full of caveats.
Yeah, for sure, and moreover, people are going to see this in the context of other historical political theories and present day political realities, right? So just to bring in one, for example, like this stuff that they're saying on screen here, this is very similar to like what you'll get if you read The Prince by Machiavelli, right?
Yeah.
I think maybe not the third one so much. I don't think he really goes into saying man's natural state is lawless anarchy, but the first two certainly. He definitely goes into basically saying it is the job of a head of state to be self-interested and to seek power. I think Machiavelli even saw it as like, he doesn't quite put it this way, but he almost seemed to see it as like a moral duty of the head of state to do what is in the best interest of his own like people and regime, right? And therefore, like, he then goes on to write this manual about how he thinks one can most effectively pursue the security and economic interests of the state that they're governing, and a big part of what was so controversial about it at the time was this precept number 2, where he's basically saying that like a lot of the ideals of the way that people think that politics should work can get in the way of actually being able to do politics effectively.
Yeah.
Realism has existed for a very long time. In order to justify their starting assumptions, realists often make an appeal to human nature and in particular to history. One such example is Thucydides' famous account of the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides describes as the confrontation between a honor-bound and, in principle, idealist Sparta with the strongest land army against Athens, the sea power, with a practical and cynical approach to diplomacy and war, who distinctly argue that morality has never triumphed over self-interest and superior strength. Debates over ideas, although fictional, litter the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is why it was not simply interpreted as an account of historical facts, but as the start of a theoretical work. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Melian dialogues. in which Athenians seek to capture the small, inconsequential, independent Spartan colony on the Greek island of Melos. I will leave a link to it in the description, as it is a really good read and helps understand, and I'll do a recording of it with a friend for those of you who are too lazy to read, so you can listen to it.
Thank you, Kraut.
The Melians, though militarily weak, do not wish to stray from the ideal that they have the right to be an independent and self-organized polity, and believe that the gods and their allies will come to their aid so that what is right and fair may triumph. The Athenians, on the other hand, seek to convince them to face the facts and surrender rather than face their extinction, and make the point that Athens must conquer them as a show of strength, lest it be thought of as weak. Because the Athenians are animated by the purpose of power, which seems to force their hand just for its own sake. In the end, Melos refuses to surrender, and all men of military age are killed, and the rest sold into slavery in one inconsequential skirmish of the war. I personally like using Machiavelli's The Prince to explain this. Written in a time when Italy was dominated by city-states.
Bro, you just pre-watched everything.
Provide for power and dominance.
I swear I didn't.
Machiavelli wrote that a good ruler cannot be driven by ideals, in particular those of the domineering religious morality, but must engage in the struggles of competing Italian.
All right, next prediction. Sun Tzu's Art of War comes up.
What benefits the city-state's position? The prince, in order to succeed, has to therefore engage in actions and policies that may be deemed as morally objectionable or even outright evil. But such objections based on ideals and conceptions of morality are a pointless sideshow, a distraction from success in the game of power. Means therefore justify the ends in a way. But it would also be a grave misconception to present the realist school as one of people endlessly justifying bloodthirsty conquests and conquerors. There are many historical figures and events that realists like to study as a foundation of interpreting modern geopolitics, and that includes most notably peacemaking. One example is the Napoleonic Wars, in which realists disregard Napoleon and instead praise Metternich. Napoleon, from the realist perspective, was someone who destabilized the balance of European powers, where each one could more or less keep the others in check. He did so by driving French territory and sister republic buffer states deep into Italian, Austro-Hungarian and Russian lands, thereby turning them all against France in coalitions that he could not hope to defeat. Metternich, however, is often regarded by many realists to be an ideal guideline of how to conduct foreign policy. Through hard-boiled calculations, ruthless power politics, the creation of an intricate network of alliances, taking account for the spheres of influence of others while not losing sight of one's own aspirations, Metternich, the de facto ruler of Imperial Austria, despite his country losing the most battles of the Napoleonic Wars, managed to guide the Austrian Empire to coming out on top at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, gaining new territories, securing and expanding its sphere of influence, and making it one of the most powerful powers in Europe despite its internal problems. And most of all, creating a system of power distribution, called the Concert of Europe, where every power was so expertly balanced against each other that there would be no major European war for almost a century. Bismarck is another historic figure that realists have much admiration for. His cold and ruthless application of power politics is famous, playing games of power and influence with Austria, Denmark, France and the German states, carefully playing them out against each other, always careful to not overextend and be in a state in which he would be outnumbered by enemies, and transforming Prussia into a German empire. Not for an offensive war of conquest, but rather by defensively unifying them against the French in a union so lasting it became its own state. We can learn more by looking at a historical figure for which realists have a lot of scorn and hold up as the worst type of geopolitical leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Because a core foundation of realism is not just an advocacy of cold, hard-boiled power politics with the intention of becoming the strongest power on earth. There may not be rules to game of power politics, but there are limitations. And these limitations are determined by the other players in the game. And if these players can't become the most powerful players, they will go for the second best thing, their own security and existence. As Hegel said, the state has no higher duty than of maintaining itself. Kaiser Wilhelm disregarded these other players. as well as their aspirations and spheres of influence. He managed to threaten simultaneously the French with the Agadir and Tangier crisis, the British with the building of the High Seas Fleet, and the Russians with the unconditional backing of Austria-Hungary, sacking three great powers against him for the price of a single dysfunctional alliance with Austria that was based more on misguided ideals rather than by geopolitical calculations, and another with the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. In the end, from the realist perspective, Kaiser Wilhelm, who did not appreciate the limitations that were set by other players in the game of powers, managed to unite all the other power players against him and lost what Bismarck had built. So take note of this, because this is something that many fail to understand about realism. Realism is not an instruction manual on how to gain unlimited power and influence based on an unrestrained application of power in politics. Realism also argues for restraint. Realism argues that powers must appreciate that other powers also play the game of power. Realism argues that one should calculate one's geopolitical decisions of foreign policy in appreciation of those informal limitations set by other powers. To put oneself in their shoes before thinking to act to gain advantage, lest you lock each other in an inefficient and avoidable conflict. This very part is a weakness of the realist school. My friend Frog did a very good video presenting that weakness, and he helped me somewhat with this video, so I will leave a link to his video in the description here too. For my outline on realism, I'm going to use the author Hans Morgenthau, who is one of the founding thinkers of modern realism as a school of international relations and geopolitics. This is not to say that he is the only one or the most important. There are many other important realist thinkers.
I'm trying to think about the thing that he said a minute ago about this is a weakness of the realist school of thought, and I'm not sure I followed the point that he was making. Did you get that?
No, I think he's about to lay that out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, never mind then.
Morgenthau just happens to be the one that I read and am more familiar with, specifically his book, Politics Amongst Nations. Like Thucydides and Machiavelli, Morgenthau argued that all international relations is driven by natural laws of struggles for power between states. His theory is not just descriptive, it has predictions. To formulate and implement effective policy, one should not build it upon one's ideals of what one believes is good for society, but study power dynamics, understand the natural laws that govern power struggles between human beings, and formulate one's policy on what would work most effectively in this power struggle. Morgenthau argued that nation-states are the foundation of all international politics, and that national interests were the main motivations behind all foreign policies, that the desire for and pursuit of raw power, at best to secure the existence and continuation of the state, was the reason for and by which nation-states engaged in the world to enlarge or defend their national interests. Power being defined by Morgenthau as the control over the minds and actions of men, in particular political power as the mutual relations of control among the holders of authority and between the latter and the people at large. Because of the fact that nation-states pursue an expansion of their sphere of influence in competition with others, insecurity and the threat of violence is a constant, ever-present state that will never go away. Hence, the full title of Politics Among Nations, the struggle for power and peace. That is because every nation-state is out there to use whatever means it can to expand its national influence. Additionally, being exclusively defensive in one sphere of influence rather than offensive in growing a sphere of influence does not often work as a means to escape the constant potential for conflict. Because even if every actor was faithfully doing this, any defensive action taken by nation-states could be seen as offensive by its competitors, and therefore produce a counter-defensive action, thereby continuing a cycle of aggression. Realists call this the security dilemma. Morgenthau also argued that national interests are dynamic, meaning they change over time and are influenced by factors such as culture and technology. One has to constantly reevaluate what one's national interests are, for if they change and one doesn't realize this, it is possible to waste enormous resources only to just lose the game of power. Let me give an example. After the end of Mongol rule over China, the Chinese spent almost 600 years fighting and trying to conquer the steppe peoples of Mongolia and Central Asia. It was in their interest at the time. They wished to secure themselves from the invaders of the past, and they wanted to make sure that something like the Mongol conquest of China could never ever happen again. But in doing so for almost 600 years, the Chinese neglected every other geopolitical sphere, such as their eastern neighbors. They neglected their coastlines. They lost spheres of influence over Japan and the rest of Asia. They neglected seafaring. They neglected technological developments in ocean navigation. They neglected new military technologies that were not useful in fighting steppe peoples. They neglected bureaucratic and institutional reforms. They neglected the new economic developments around coastal commerce. And they neglected the resulting cultural and political developments in societies. Consequently, they did not realize the significance of European imperial powers arriving. By the 1780s, the Chinese had successfully conquered and pacified Mongolia, Southeast Siberia, and the eastern parts of Central Asia. But the peoples from these lands who they had conquered and who had, yes, menaced China for almost 2,000 years, had stopped being a threat to China 300 years before. Mongolia was no longer the priority.
Can we pause again for a second?
Instead, the
I think the way this is being framed seems really implausible to me. Like okay, here's the part of it that does make sense to me, is to say that, like, maybe they prioritized things that they shouldn't have prioritized. However, if you're just going to say, like, because they were so focused on pacifying Mongolia and Central Asia, this is why they neglected these 10 other things, I don't think that's really adequate to explain it. I mean, like one could be really focused on pacifying Mongolia and Central Asia while doing those things too, and because, like, banking and trade, for example, might help facilitate those things, and so just to say that they're focused on this one thing instead, I think is, like, not really an adequate explanation.
I don't know. I think it's a question of not what's possible, but what's probable. It's sort of like, I'm going to use an analogy here that might completely fall apart, but there is always this question sometimes in sports or esports, where you'll see a player that's really good at one specific thing in their game. So to use basketball for an example, I don't know anything about basketball for the most part, but to use basketball for example, let's say you have a player who's like the best the best like free throw shooter there is. Like whenever there's like a foul and they get to do like the free basketball shot, like he always nails those. People will sometimes be like, well, why doesn't he also become really good at another thing? And I think it's a question of the relative ability or the relative probability that a person is going to be able to be good at both of those things simultaneously, or even more things. And I think to then sort of analogize that to this question, it's not a question of it would be impossible for China to be as focused on Mongolia as they were and also still be adept in their other fields, but it's a probability that you are only going to be so good at so many things, and that if you're consuming focus and resources on one thing, you're probably less likely to be successful on other things, as opposed to if you had been putting that focus and resources on those things.
Okay, so it does make sense, the idea that they have different priorities that are competing for focus and resources, right? But to the best of my understanding, like, I don't think that's actually an adequate explanation for, like, what happened historically in China. Because, for example, them trying to shut out European trade, that's not a matter of them just failing to put enough resources into it. That's a matter of them actively opposing it. And it's so, like, as far as like a basketball player, it's the way that analogy strikes me is like, yes, it actually would be advantageous for this basketball player to become better at this other thing, but maybe they just can't. But I just don't think that applies to, nation states that are focused on their security and international power. So, and I think, like, we can just see this easily enough from other examples of nations that have succeeded at doing a bunch of conquest while also succeeding at advancing technologically and commercially and stuff. So like during this same time period when China was doing this, the British were out conquering half the world and becoming like the most wealthy and technologically advanced nation at the time. And it's like,
I think, oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah. And I think, like, you could partly explain that by saying, like, yeah, the British were focused on it in a different way than the Chinese were, right? But I don't think it's just a matter of focus. Like, I think the Chinese society, to the best of my historical understanding, was like purposely insular and shutting out a lot of those things in a way that's not explained by their focus on Mongolia and Central Asia.
Yeah, I guess The thing that I don't know is I don't know the specifics of why China in this time period failed in certain areas and succeeded in others. Because I think that descriptive question then comes down to, is there any conflict there? But I do think that the idea does make sense that there is probably that there are some that, depending upon the situation of a nation, in order for them to do a thing, it might consume some bandwidth that is also in competition by another task that requires said bandwidth. So it might be the case that, and that's going to be dependent upon the context, right? So, for example, Britain was able to do a lot of things simultaneously, but I think that has more to do with their particular situation than the idea that those things don't have conflict. Whereas I think, like, if you look at like Russia, for example, sometimes the sort of immense leaps forward that Russia had in terms of their advancement had to be very much dragged there. I think it's I'm not very good on history, but I think it's Peter the Great before what is a famous example of this, where he literally melted down like the church bells in order to make cannons and stuff, because they had such an inability to like obtain metal and the proper resources, and it was hugely controversial at the time. Stalin obviously dedicated a huge amount of the bandwidth of the Soviet state towards his 5-year plan to try and sort of wrench the Russia into the industrial stage. So I think it's just a question of, is this the kind of, I don't think there are necessarily things that inherently require bandwidth, but things often do depending upon the context, for the state to take an interest and exert influence to get that to do it. America didn't really have to, the American state didn't have to exert a lot of direct influence to get America to industrialize, whereas in Russia they did. So I think it's just a question of, what are you doing, and based off of your specific context, does that require the state to exert its will? And if so, then that's going to be in conflict with other aspirations that also require the state to exert its will in a very sort of direct way.
Yes, so I think that what you're saying is right. I just don't think it suffices to explain this example. That's all.
Yeah. I've got no idea about this part of Chinese history, so that could totally be the case.
Okay, yeah, sure.
British opium merchants who arrived at the same time along the coast were. China did not realize that its national interests had changed, and consequently China took a huge loss in the game of power. As this example shows, there is no such thing as a permanent national interest. A nation should not consistently pursue the same goal throughout time, because the environment can substantially change. Therefore, according to Morgenthau, one should continuously study and re-evaluate the national interests of a nation and adapt to changing dynamics of the power game. Morgenthau also argued that any idealism is entirely misplaced, self-limiting and pointless in the study of international politics. Nation-states, groups, communities, and societies may develop concepts of morality and ethics, but a universal application of such systems of ethics is not possible, because every moral system must be trickled down to the specifics of any given situation. Nations, therefore, ought to separate their own moral aspiration from ideals of moral universalism, legalism, or sentimentality. Values and concepts of ethics should be strived towards discussion of implementation at home, but have no place on the international stage. The inspiration...
It's so dumb. I'm sorry, but you're just saying, but the problem is, that is an idea of morals, right? You're saying hold on, we need to have this greater framework for our context of how we do morals, but you're introducing a moral question there that would first need to be settled in moral in a moral argument, right? A lot of people would say, right, we could look at a specific application and say, the promotion of freedom or democracy, that's something that we take a moral interest in. And you would say, well, hold on, no, you can't do that, because we already agreed that within the moral context, we can't promote this abroad. But but that is the moral idea in and of itself, and now we need to debate it on moral terms, right? You might say that, the practical application is a question that we consider in our moral discussions, but that still is then taking place inside of the moral context. It feels like it feels like you're really putting the cart before the horse.
Well, it seems like they're baking in this assumption that ideals are necessarily going to be contrary or orthogonal to the power game, and I just think that's not always the case. So For example, like what you brought up about if it is in the national interest of America to have freedom and democracy, or however we construe that, around the world, so that more countries will align with us politically, like that might be in our that might be advantageous to us on the foreign policy stage. But then, like, if the ideals that we're promoting happen to align with that, then idealism is actually working in favor of the power game and not the other way around. And therefore, like, this advice to like disregard ideals is counterproductive to the goal they're trying.
Yeah.
And historic events that led the political scientist Morgenthau to conclude this were the failure of idealistic international organizations and governing bodies such as the League of Nations in preventing the Second World War. In summary, Morgenthau argued that there are ultimately no ideals or rules that govern international politics and relations. Instead, international politics is driven solely by power politics. The only rules that exist are informal and created not deliberately, but by the restraints of one's power by other powers. Morgenthau believed that international politics is somewhat like a poker game, that this poker game is played by great powers, such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, that these great powers have spheres of influence which contain smaller nation-states, and these smaller nation-states are the chips played in the poker game of geopolitics. Therefore, foreign policy should be driven with a disregard of idealism in favor of cold, hard-boiled calculations of how to play this poker game. But here's the catch. The game never stops. From the realist perspective, nobody can ever win this game. The poker game is assumed to be endless. The poker chips are constantly exchanged in an endless power struggle. Nobody can ever fully enforce their ideals over others, because this power struggle is shaped by cold national interests in power. Great powers may sometimes lose their great power and thereby lose their spheres of influence to new great powers, but geopolitics will always be dominated by great powers and struggles over their spheres of influence. The potential for violence and escalation, therefore, never stops. The realist also assumes that if all players gang up on one, that one will stand up and draw a gun before losing to everyone. And it is that potential for violent escalation that the realist wants to avoid at all costs, in particular in the post-World War II era of nuclear weapons. Now, let me interrupt here briefly to address something. Many of you will have probably noticed and already pointed out in the comments how similar a lot of this is to the writings of very different thinkers from very different schools, like Habermas, Adorno, Carl Schmitt, Alfred Rosenberg, Julius Evola, Hoppe, or Michel.
I was just going to say that.
The underlying assumption that there are no values, that ideals and ideologies and rules are just lies and excuses, and that all that matters are power dynamics and the game of power. The fact that they all sound so similar is not a coincidence, and neither is it a test.
I just want to pause here for a second. Man, do you not write this entire do you not write this life's work of a way to analyze international relations and never stop and think, man, it seems like ideas are really motivating to people at an individual scale. But I wonder if that has any implications. Man, it really feels like the idea that this is something that I sort of run into in moral debates as well, is the idea that, no one has any real morals. It's all just us justifying our feelings. And I think that's actually true to some degree, right? It's no surprise to me that I think, vegans point to, dogs more than bugs. But you really think it's all just bullshit? That doesn't seem very explanatory to human history or individual relations or the times that people do fight over things that they don't have a really empathetic connection to. Not to say that they're right or wrong, but abortion remains a hugely divisive issue in the United States. And there's no if you look at and regularly in abortion debates, pro-choice people will, well, I shouldn't say regularly, but sometimes in internet discourse, pro-choice people will point to the fact that pictures of a picture of a fetus doesn't look anything human at all. But people defend that even to the point of a clump of cells. So it really doesn't seem explanatory to say that humans are purely interested, or I guess in this case that nations are purely interested in just questions of power. It almost reminds me of actually some of the more left-leaning analysis of corporations that I really don't like. People talk about corporations like they're these monolithic entities where it's I desire profit. And that's true to a certain degree, but they're also made up of people that have ideas and flaws and beliefs. And the same is true of nations. So it just feels like you're just missing a huge part of what drives human behavior.
Yeah, so I want to latch on to what you were saying at the beginning and the end there. There were parts in the middle that I disagree with, but I think you're right to say that ideals are very motivating to people on an individual level. And I'm going to go further and say not just on an individual level, but because people in the same society and culture share a lot of ideals with
They
one
want to be part
another.
of something.
Yeah, it's very motivating to people on the group level, and maybe not on a worldwide level, but at least within your in group, you probably all have like some similar ideals that you share, right? Um, I'm kind of hesitant to agree about with the thing about corporations, just because I think the mentality that people have about corporate, like, of course it's true that there are people working there that have their own individual goals that don't necessarily align with the company making money, and so therefore not every single action that a person, that people in corporations do is gonna be toward that one goal. But a corporation is organized with the explicit goal of just
Oh
making
yeah.
profit, and they're legally required to do it, and they can like be sued if otherwise, right? It's this very heavy incentive structure for them to behave in this way, and people sign up to participate in a corporation. They do it for money, but because they're literally being paid to do it, and also for money in the sense that making money for the corporation, it is seen as the measure of their success in doing it.
Yeah, I don't disagree there. I think just like nations, power is still the main goal. In the same way, corporations monetary is still the main goal. But even if it's like 80%, that's still one fifth, which is a lot, I think, and it's probably even higher. But even something as small as like, well, it explains 5% of their behavior. Man, 5%, that's actually a lot. When and to have like a whole ideology, or I should say ideology necessarily, but a whole school of thought trying to predict and give us good ideas of what we ought to do is missing what can be still a big chunk of the motivation. I think that's where you can start to fall astray. And I think
Uh-huh.
similarly, sometimes people overly ascribe corporations, well, they're only ever going to do just what is going to bring them the greatest profit, can sometimes also lead you astray in your analysis of corporations as well. It just feel it's what I said in the beginning. I feel like these are not necessarily problematic ideas, but like, man, you just go so far with them. Like I don't understand
Yeah.
like why you do this. Where it's like, oh, well, I think that the most reliable way to predict, what a nation is going to do is, based off of the power that they have and what what the power of other nations that they're opposed to have. It's like, oh, I don't necessarily disagree, and nothing else. There's absolutely nothing else that matters. It's like, why you were so close to having like a really good statement, and then just threw for content at the very end. I just it feels. It doesn't make sense. I feel like there's got to be something I'm missing, because I feel this way about so many things. The only thing I've never felt this way about in terms of schools of thought, and I'm not like classically educated on any of this stuff, so maybe I'm just a total dumbass, but like I just feel like everyone should be an intersectional feminist. I'm gonna be honest here. It's just like you have someone describe intersectional feminism to you, and they're like, oh, what's intersectional feminism? And they're like, oh, it's where you take into account all the things instead of just one of them. And it's like, that's an ideology. Shouldn't we just do that? Like I'm sure I'm being overly charitable in a way to intersectional feminism here, but like the idea that like intersectional feminism, people, they were like, oh, we're gonna take into account the fact that you're a woman and the fact that you're black, and people were like, oh my god, I never thought of that. It's like, how you guys weren't doing this before? I don't understand. That just makes like basic sense. The fact that you would take into account multiple things. Like I don't understand, man.
Yeah. Okay, so on the foreign policy thing, here's where I think I can meet you halfway. Is because I think what realism is doing is not, at least as I perceive it right now. I've probably got a lot to learn about this, but here's the way it appears to me: is not that it's trying to describe every detail of human behavior with respect to foreign policy. Well, I think what it's trying to do is just give like a good first order approximation that like this is basically how nations behave most of the time. It's a really good starting point for thinking about and predicting how they're going to behave. Your predictions are going to be successful more often than not when you use this, and and so therefore like when it fails, it's like well, like you said, there might be 20% of outlier scenarios where the predictions fail, but a predictive model that succeeds 80% of the time is still substantially better than nothing.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
to the influence of Morgenthau. The reason why they all sound so similar is because of a shared historical experience. It is not a coincidence, but it is also not a conspiracy. They may all sound similar, they may have even partially read each other, but they didn't all conspire somehow to come to and promote similar.
Oh, can we pause for a second?
Yeah.
We just got a chat comment that Evolian Solarman says, a lot of the realist thinkers address a lot of what you're saying. Most of Evola's writing is talking about power in relation to groups, but also how religion and morals informs motivation. So there you go. Anybody who wants to learn more about this, maybe we should read Evola.
Yeah, I hope this video gets into that, because I guess, to be fair, I have not done any, reading of, classic realist theory or anything like that. But at least and I guess, to be fair, I think this could be one of the cases where the ideology or I don't want to say philosophers, but it's a lot like if you've ever sort of had this experience where you develop this opinion of a certain school of philosophical thought based off of everyone that talks to you about it, and it turns out that they're all being really bad salesmen for what it is. It's actually not nearly as bad as they made it out to be. I wonder if we're going to get in, as we get into this video, if that's going to be the case with realism, because man, whenever I see people talk about realism and application to things that I am informed about in the modern context, I think Ukraine is the obvious example, even by, I think even by actual realist thinkers like Mearsheimer, it's just man, this just seems so dumb. But yeah, hopefully we're going to get into that.
Yeah, so the general principle of what you're saying, I think, is the exact reason why we generally need to take charitable interpretations of new ideas presented to us or ideas that we disagree with, because I think it is usually the case that people are bad salesmen for their own ideas. It's a lot of times people will say something that it's okay, if I take you super literally at face value, this is just really dumb, but I can maybe it can point me in the general direction of something, and then I can figure out there's something of value that's adjacent to what you're saying, and it can still be informative even if not in every detail.
Mm-hmm. And that is because they all have their origins in the same thing, something called the crisis of modernity. What is the crisis of modernity? In the wake of the Enlightenment, there was a common understanding throughout political schools of thought that humanity could advance and perfect itself through the rational examination of the world it inhabited, bypassing the crude institutions of unjustified tradition and faith that had held society back. There was a frontier to be won, and with it the promise of a perfected civil and moral order for mankind. From that perspective, in 1789, the French Revolution upended 1,000 years of primitive despotism and institutional stagnancy, guided by bold propositions inherited straight from the Enlightenment: universal human rights, freedom, equality and brotherhood, ideals that every contemporary liberal democracy is built upon. A few years into the revolution, Kant published Zum ewigen Frieden, or Toward a Perpetual Peace, a treatise of international relations that is the foundation of a liberal theory of international relations. Concurrently, advances in technology and science enabled the uplifting of standards of living, travel, education, while the abundance of production increasingly melted away the entrenched poverty of the world, together with breakthroughs in medicine and sanitation, such as through the eradication of germs. During this sudden hiccup of years of progress during the 1800s, what had seemed impossible for all of history, the methodical repealing of every horseman of the apocalypse, is made possible through rational examination of the physical world, and it yields many more bounties: knowledge over universal laws, mastery over nature. Hegel, the prime example of this historicism of the 19th century, observed the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas and declared that the realization of human freedom is the ultimate goal of history, and that it will come to be through the creation of the perfect state. When he witnessed Napoleon defeat Prussia in Jena in 1806, he declared that this moment was the end of history. The French had created the political innovation of the nation-state, and all of history as a political development was just a process of achieving what the French had achieved. But that belief in progress through modernity that had so domineered throughout political schools of thought throughout the 1800s was shattered at the beginning of the 20th century. Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, Isonzo, Gallipoli. In the killing fields of the First Global War, where generations experienced mechanized death brought on by technological and scientific development, a war that was promised by those who believed in political progress that it would be the last war. only for their promise to be almost immediately broken by the Second World War, which industrialized the death process and spread it, by design, to civilian populations. It would be a mistake to assume that faith in modernity, which we understand as rationalist drives, was upended merely by the process of applied sciences. Almost every field is confronted at the same time by limitations of pure rationality. In mathematics, there is the foundations crisis, where formalists stand refusing proofs of the intuitionist camp, on the grounds that they require an infinite number of steps that can therefore not be reproduced formally. Yet this is how we proceed to build real numbers. Gödel throws the whole field into disarray when he theorized that the axioms of mathematics can neither be consistent or able to prove all true theories, sending all mathematicians ever since into an exercise of faith in their axiomatic systems. In physics, the quantum realm fractures the discipline into various schools, the schism being still unresolved. Among others, the uncertainty principle, that you can neither know accurately the position or the speed and direction of a particle, raises questions about the limits of rational observation and experimentation. In economics and international relations, paradoxes of rationality forced the injection of psychology in endeavors of formal rationalism, creating behavioralism where an arithmetic of wealth distribution and peacemaking was anticipated. In 1938, Husserl wrote in The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology of a crisis of European humanities, the disproportionate evolution of the hard sciences compared to the humanities. Though mathematical and physical problems may cast doubt upon the role of rationality as a driver of human progress, the worst development is not that the claim to modernity of the sciences is broken, but that the humanities broke before the sciences did. For example, humanity advanced into the nuclear age without the political tools to make humanity's survival in a nuclear age a certainty. And in our day and age, while having still not solved this conundrum of the nuclear age, a second, that of climate change, piles on as the gap between science and the humanities remains. Ironically, centuries before we faced these conundrums, figures of the Enlightenment itself were already aware of this conundrum and warned of it. As the French Renaissance humanist François Rabelais famously wrote, "Science without conscience is but ruin of the soul." Hegel's vision of a perfect state that would end history died in the early 20th century, in struggles and conflicts perpetuated by those who wished to achieve that end of history. What was left in its ashes was not an idealistic striving for modernity, but best described by Churchill, the worst system of government with the exception of all others. Churchill's rashness towards other forms of government stems from the fact that he spent a great deal of his career fighting them. The main political innovation of the 20th century, and a direct answer to modernity, were fascist and totalitarian regimes whose main accomplishments were the destruction of idealistic institutions, violent lawless barbarism, and the creation of new crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity. In the Soviet Union, communism, a political force that supposedly would usher in the end of history through a supposedly scientific understanding of humanity and history, ushered in a regime of mass arrests, paranoia, gulags, mass graves, and famines. The fact that these systems, which were always constructed as a rejection of the modern world, not only existed but were able to seriously threaten modernity for the better part of the century, was felt as the final traumatic wake-up call from the historicism of modernity for many thinkers, at least those who made it out of the early 20th century alive. Stefan Zweig wrote a very quotable suicide note disguised as a book called The World of Yesterday, in which he reminisces the pre-war world which he adored, from which the fascists drove him because of his ethnicity, and gives an account of the losing fight that he and his fellow intellectuals fought to prevent its methodical destruction during the world wars. My friend Frog recommended me this book, and I highly recommend that book to you as well. Many political thinkers concluded from the horrors from 1914 to 1945 that modernity and the idea of progress was a lie. Almost all of them concluded that what mattered in the end were just power dynamics. The reason all the thinkers I cited earlier sound so similar is because they all have similar origins in a time period in which the concept of modernity and the concept of idealism was questioned. Fascists saw modernity as a manipulation. The Nazis saw it as a Jewish lie. The Nazis specifically believed that what ultimately mattered was competition for resources between races, and the power dynamics of a race war is all that matters. One of the foundational texts of Nazi political theory is Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century. in which he outlines a theory of history as mainly driven by racial struggles and competition for resources. The Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt declared the liberal state to be too weak for the preservation of a functioning social order, declared that all politics was struggles for power between enemies, that all disagreements were ultimately conflicts between enemies, and that therefore a fascist leader must attain absolute power. Carl Schmitt also applied this line of thought in his writings on geopolitics as driven by nothing but ruthless cold power dynamics in which might makes right. And the fascist political theorist Julius Evola wrote in his Revolt Against the Modern World that tradition was inherently a political force that lacked concepts of political theory and therefore contradicted the idea of progress or modernity, which had to be destroyed. Fascism fundamentally advocates for and is an ideology based upon the destruction of modernity and idealism, in favor of a lawlessness of power dynamics. But they were not the pioneers of the crisis of modernity. A century before the Nazis, Johann Gottlieb Fichte spoke a series of speeches, the Addresses to the German Nation, which was an attack against the ideals that the French occupation had imported to Prussia. Fichte in his speeches outlined a concept of the world as a power struggle among races, and in rejection of any ideals of universalism, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Adorno, Habermas, and Foucault were leftists disillusioned with Marx, because the material conditions for communism that Marx had predicted never came to be. They therefore abandoned the traditional Marxist historical materialism as a driving mechanism of history. They abandoned the concept of progress as well, and instead analyzed history with a focus on groups who had historically been oppressed, be it colonized peoples, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or sexual minorities. They concluded that there were no ideals or rules, but merely the power dynamics of oppression and liberation from oppression. Hoppe was a student of Habermas, who merely used the same conclusions to advocate for the abolition of any state concept of rules and ideals in favor of a ruthless, lawless, anarchist capitalism. And finally we get to Morgenthau, who came to his conclusions when faced with the rise of the Nazis and even argued explicitly in 1946 that belief in human reason was deficient because of the rise of Nazi Germany. It would be a mistake, though, to think of Morgenthau as a Machiavellian figure instead of a tragic one. Morgenthau was a German liberal and supporter of the Weimar Republic. He lived through its collapse and the rise of fascism throughout Europe. He despaired at this, fled into exile in the United States, where he was confronted with an American unwillingness to face the outbreak of the Second World War and its consequences, right up until those came knocking at Pearl Harbor. He despaired at what he lived through and concluded that what he had witnessed had happened because liberalism and the liberal state were shackled by its own ideals and put in the same danger that had uprooted his life. Morgenthau therefore believed that liberal democracies of the world cannot engage in a foreign policy that is based on liberal ideas, that the liberal power of this world, the United States, must act ruthlessly and often against its own liberal values on the international stage to preserve itself. Contrary to his recommendations, though, Morgenthau did stand up to US foreign policy makers in the name of his own morals on more than one occasion. For instance, he was one of the first academics to object to the Vietnam War. In 1966, in The Purpose of Political Science, Morgenthau wrote that the US had overlearned the lessons of realism and lost sight of the appropriate legal and moral limits to the application of power, and was even fired from his post because of his protest.
See, that is more of what I feel like is a holistic viewpoint based in realism that I guess to be fair really does come down to the specifics and the edge cases as to whether or not you and whether or not you agree or disagree, and I guess that's just why I feel like so disconnected from a lot of sort of modern realists, is I feel like just descriptively they're so far off the mark on things like Ukraine.
I mean it makes sense if I try to frame it in terms of just human psychology or whatever, right? Because I think they are trying to describe human behavior. In some sense, it should be reducible to individual psychology. And I think you were right to say earlier that people are very motivated on an individual level by things that don't fit into this framework.
Yeah.
In the early days of the Cold War, he was an opponent to policies of containment that could frivolously make enemies of the USSR. In the first edition of Politics Among Nations, he argued the changed structure of the balance of power has made the hostile opposition of two gigantic power blocks possible, but it has not made it inevitable, and considered a bipolar world having the potential for unheard of good as well as for unprecedented evil. At first he noted that bipolarity would fix in place the balance of power, alliances no longer being able to decisively affect it because of the sheer mass of the two superpowers and their ability to hold states in a bloc even against their will, thus creating spheres of influence. But in the third edition of Politics Amongst Nations, seeing the new bloc of unaligned nations, the experience of the Korean War, he prescribed that Moscow and Washington should adapt their policies to the wishes of their allies if they wanted to draw maximum strength from their support. To summarize his view, the United States are a poker player, Western Europe and South America are its poker chips. The Soviet Union is a poker player, Eastern Europe and Central Asia its poker chips. And in order to secure a lasting peace, stability, and liberal democracy itself, American foreign policy must be focused on securing its own sphere of influence, while parallel to that, not infringing on the Soviet sphere of influence. The end goal of this realist foreign policy is to find and maintain a balance between global powers. You probably already noticed, and you are correct, that realism played an important role in American Cold War foreign policy. After Morgenthau fled to the United States, his ideas were very welcomed among the leading political figures of the United States. Realism became the core foundation of American foreign policy for almost 50 years. It is the reason why the Americans did not intervene or do anything to help Eastern Europeans in anti-communist uprisings. From the realist point of view, these countries were in the Soviet and consequently Russian sphere of influence. Their aspirations for ending communist tyranny were irrelevant. They were in a Russian sphere of influence, and in the interest of maintaining a balance of powers, were left to whatever the Russians wanted to do with them. At the same time, the United States had to be utterly ruthless in maintaining control over its own sphere of influence, from the Cuban blockade to various American-backed military dictators, in order to secure its own sphere of influence. It should be pointed out that realism does not offer some sort of singular objective formula that everyone follows through to the same conclusions. I mentioned before that Morgenthau was fired for protesting the war in Vietnam. There were realists who believed that Vietnam was in the American sphere of influence and crafted the infamous domino theory. But there were also prominent realists like Morgenthau who believed that Vietnam was not in the American sphere of influence. He also did not believe that Vietnam was in a Soviet or Chinese sphere of influence. He believed that Vietnam was fighting a civil war, and even though there was a communist side in this civil war, this did not mean that the Communist Party of Vietnam was aligned to the Soviet Union or Communist China. So, as you can see, realism does come with disagreements amongst realists. The archetype realist statesman, who many realists praise, is Henry Kissinger. He disdained international, idealistic and rules-based organizations such as the United Nations, but still used it for a policy of détente with the Soviet Union to preserve a balance of powers, while ruthlessly playing poker with Chile, Argentina, Vietnam, Syria, Israel, China, India and Bangladesh over the American sphere of influence, irrespective of what the United Nations may think of it. The Nixon administration was the height of realism being America's foreign policy doctrine. And by the standards of realism, the Nixon administration were expert poker players and are the ideal of what American foreign policy should be. They played Syria and Egypt out against each other to nudge Egypt into an American sphere of influence. They ended communist influence in South America through empowering brutal dictators, and legitimized China as a player on the poker table to then leverage that against the Soviet Union for a policy of entente. And the architect of that realist golden age of American foreign policy was Henry Kissinger. Kissinger's honors dissertation that he wrote as an undergrad at Harvard attacked Kant and Hegel, specifically their notions of there being a process of historical progress. Instead, he argued that history was a continuous, chaotic process of power struggles, where ideological concepts and idealism over societal reform and progress were meaningless. Therefore, in no moral authority, concepts of ethics, no ideology, no religion, and no ideal whatsoever had any guiding role to play. A very nihilistic view, which Kissinger would later mirror as US Secretary of State when he said that the Soviet Union was an ever-present danger to the international world that would continue to exist for centuries to come, and therefore the American public should get used to it. That any striving to end the Soviet Union
so much for that predictive model.
Instead was on terms with the fact that the future would be shaped by a geopolitical game of power and influence with the Soviet Union, in which finding a balance of power would be the ideal foreign policy. Realism continued to dominate American foreign policy right up to the 1980s, when Reagan became US president. Reagan was not a realist, but an idealist. Reagan aggressively pursued the destruction of communist influence, including in places that were considered to be a Soviet sphere of influence, like Afghanistan, East Germany, and Poland. And it is the end of the Cold War where realism faced its greatest challenges, because to many political theorists, the end of the Cold War and the death of communism proved that the realists had been wrong. Under the Bush 41 presidency, a new foreign policy doctrine was formulated from the success of the Reagan administration that saw the United States as the sole superpower, protector of the world's democracies, and the policeman who intervened when undemocratic regimes violated international rules. Bush also wanted Europe to sort out its own affairs and to refocus American attention on building deeper ties and alliances in East Asia instead of Europe. The ultimate goal of this would be in the long term to repeat with China what had happened to the Soviet Union. Under Clinton, the US returned to realism. That may sound surprising to you, but yes, many forget that the Clintons are students of Kissinger. So we saw a return to a foreign policy largely based on realist assumptions under the Clintons. The US had a guiding role over Europe, India was insultingly dismissed as a Russian poker chip, and Russia could do whatever it wanted to do to the Chechens, and most of its neighbors had to tie in line with Russia. Bush 43 was part of a new conservative political school that evolved from Reagan.
Man, I feel like the Yugoslav wars are worth some sort of mention there within the Clinton administration, because, I mean, very famously, I wonder how he would consider that to be formulated within the context of realism, because it's traditionally presented as sort of a very moral, we went in and stopped the Serbians because, they were committing genocide, and, I think there's some truth to that. It doesn't seem to me that there's like a preeminent realist interest in, who would control that, and I guess maybe just like the stability of Europe in general, since it's not that far from Germany and Italy and other Western allies. But I feel like it's worth at least a line of dialogue.
I feel like there's a lot of things being glossed over too. Like for example, like how would they say that? How would Kraut say that the first Iraq War fits into this, right? I mean, like maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. I mean, like I suppose you could see it as an ideological. As ideological aggression into the third world by the U.S., and in that case, you could frame it as consistent with this.
I think that makes sense to me. I guess like the contrast would be like if you look at like Russia, they're not exactly one-to-one, so it's difficult so that's not a perfect analogy, but like we don't intervene when Russia goes towards Chechnya because that's not our concern, because that's their sphere of influence. But it isn't our sphere of influence when Iraq invades Kuwait, but we still intervene because we think it's a moral wrong. Our ideology prompts us to. But again, that kind of underscores the whole point, which is like there's limits to both of this, right? Like I almost like a realist is still going to determine what system they want to succeed off of morals, and there's going to be some moral consideration within that. And an idealist is still going to say that we should implement tactics, and we should try and do things that are likely to succeed, and there are limits to what we can do. I don't want to. I don't know if I've talked to you before about my everyone is a utilitarian take on philosophy, but like I'm starting to.
We might have to fight about that sometime because I disagree. But
but it's just like I feel like I'm starting to get to like a similar point here, where it's like it feels like these people are not describing radically different schools of thought. Yeah. They just have different approximations for what you can and can't literally do. Because like if you told if it was the case, I don't think it is the case, but if it was the case that by supporting Ukraine we were going to cause a nuclear World War III, then I'm pretty sure even idealists, the vast majority of idealists, would be like, yeah, let's not do that. So like it just seems to be like there's like a descriptive disagreement, but like the fundamental logic that like we're going from doesn't seem to be that different. I don't know.
Yeah, it does seem like both of them are just taking the same facts and slotting them into their ideology, to make kind of two different descriptions of the same thing. And like, they're whatever the story about the blind people feeling the different parts of the elephant or something. I sort of feel like there's a little bit of that going on, but I want to call back earlier to the idea of realism as a predictive model, right? Whereas I mean maybe that's where you could kind of contrast it with with the more idealistic schools, right? I mean, like, I don't know if you would even say that there is an idealistic predictive model, or maybe there's several different idealistic predictive models, but that it seems like that's a good test case for whether or not realism is succeeding as a description.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the differences are coming down to predictions that are really the only difference is descriptive facts that then inform what you think the future is going to be, which then informs your prescriptions.
Yes.
So like, we ought not support Ukraine, or we ought support Ukraine based on the likelihood that it will either cause Russia to go to war with us, or it won't cause Russia to go to war with us. That doesn't seem. I guess if I'm trying to really put myself in the shoes of a realist, maybe a realist would still be opposed, because in their mind there is no good to helping Ukraine, because it's something because it's something that fundamentally isn't in our sphere of influence, right? It is not our poker chip. So ultimately, and in their mind, they would prefer a balance. They would prefer a balance of powers, not they would prefer, I guess, a multipolar world versus a unipolar world, because they want that balance of power. But I don't understand.
If they're thinking like Metternich, then certainly they would prefer a multipolar world, and then it makes some sense to think that that if we succeed at Ukraine, then at repelling Russia, then that kind of reinforces the dominance of the United States in international politics. It makes Russia feel more threatened, and so then maybe even if this conflict turns out well, maybe that bodes poorly for the next one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't. It doesn't seem very smart. It doesn't seem like there is a really good reason why you wouldn't want to take the opportunity to deny them that poker chip, even in a world where you're strictly concerned with what you can and what you can't. The idea that Russia must necessarily lash out if you start to deny them poker chips feels a lot less like an ideological axiom and more like a descriptive question. Well, is it the case that they'll lash out? And I feel like that is then going to be the question as to whether or not we ought to support Ukraine, just in this particular example. And I'm just struggling to really understand, because I feel like there must be more under the hood here. I don't want to, presume like, oh, I figured it out in 5 minutes. Excuse me, 75 minutes, as we've been live for. It doesn't seem to me, what I'm trying to get at is the sort of ideological roots of realism. I don't want to, we're at 3649. If we go back to here it is. Yeah, these initial 3 principles. Oh, come the fuck on, YouTube. You got one fucking job. Okay, there we go. Let me just, it's like, these are descriptive questions that change, and the degree to which they are true in a particular situation is fluid. It just feels so stupid to be like, all right, what's my axiom number 1? They're always self-interested and seek power. Because it almost must be that they're always, not that they generally are. Because if they generally are, I feel like you can't stake out what is sort of this cohesive ideology that isn't just going to I don't understand what if. It either must, it seems to me that either must be you are thinking that these 3 principles are almost always true to an extremely high degree, which seems very foolish, or the more reasonable position, well then it doesn't seem like you have an ideology. It would seem like, I should say ideology, even though they are ideological. It doesn't seem like you have a very good frame of reference, or a very good mode of analysis, such to be described as a school of thought, because then you're basically saying, well, it depends, go on a case-by-case basis. And it's like, I actually agree that you should go on a case-by-case basis, but at that point, this would then be, this is why I really like the idea of viewing these as tools on the tool belt. This is a lens by which you can analyze it. But the idea that I am a realist, I am a user of a hammer in carpentry. It's like, either you aren't a user of a hammer in carpentry, you just sometimes use a hammer like everyone does, or you always use a hammer, and that's really dumb because sometimes you use a screwdriver.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're saying makes sense, not so much as a refutation of realism, but as a limit to the scope of what you can get from it.
Yeah. I guess what I'd be really curious on. Sorry, I mean, okay, there, but just like sort of put a cap on this thought. What I would really be interested on is to talk to someone who is very classically educated on this, like talk to like not literally John Mearsheimer, but someone in that sort of realm and to that level of experience, and talk to them about this, because I feel like there must be some way to formulate this where it still makes sense to call yourself a capital R realist, but you aren't, making what I think a lot of the logical pitfalls would be in that. Or I don't know. Maybe it just falls into maybe it falls into an even deeper question of the sort of not the philosophy of science, but the philosophy of language, as to what ought we consider something distinct. What ought we consider the burden for being distinct enough within a school of thought for you to then call yourself a realist? And maybe I am ascribing too much. Maybe I'm setting the bar too high for what that should be, such that of course no one would meet that bar, because in order to meet that bar you have to be so different from what the baseline opinion is that it's very unreasonable.
So I'm trying to think if there's a Twitch poll person who comes close to this point of view that you could talk to if you want like a more robust defense of this. And off the top of my head, the best thing I've got is maybe Tiberius.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I really like Tiberius. I enjoy talking to him, but I'm not sure at all what like his background is. Sorry, we're at 36:45.
Yeah, I'm kind of inferring from other stuff I've heard him say before that he might be sympathetic to this point of view. So if you're interested in pursuing it, I mean, like that's the first person who I would think to ask. But I don't know. You might not get what you're looking for. We've got a comment here. It says, I think this is a good point, Flowtrace. Realism can't exist in a vacuum. The people working within it are beholden to and a part of cultural and social thoughts and norm. Yeah, I think we both agree with that. And then he says, a lot of realism is just geopolitical game theory. And yeah, I agree with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just to go back a few minutes, there was another thing, like when we were talking about stuff that was kind of glossed over in this, like, it just seemed like they just jumped over the second half of the 20th century. And another thing that I wish they would have gotten into more, and actually maybe he will, but to what degree was this same school of thought influential in the Soviet bloc? Right, because I would think if you're trying to make a predictive model for how the American bloc and the Soviet bloc are going to interact with each other, then it makes a lot of sense to consider, are the Soviets thinking of this in the same way?
Yeah, I think that's that and when you get into the questions of how people are thinking, that's where I think you need a much more sort of nuanced and case-by-case form of analysis. Something that I'm also thinking about here, and again, maybe this is something that like gets answered in Realism 101, and I'm just a dumbass. But like the question that Kraut mentioned earlier, as to what the sphere of influence or what the national interest is, I think that's a really important question that goes to a much more of the core of realism, where you can look at certain nations that don't seem to take a super big national interest in the games of power politics. Or if they do, it's in very, very different ways. Like if you I think the classic example would be Gaullism in France, where you can see that is very much a nation. We always think of the United States versus the Soviet Union, and the Suez Canal crisis definitely, is the ultimate demonstration that they were the ones calling the shots. But it's undoubtable that there's still different agents on the West versus the East that have their own interests, and how those manifest, I think, sort of begs the question of, is everyone really playing the game of power such that you need to play the game of power? Because it seems like there's a lot of nations that are willing and able to, at least in this context, to exist without that desire. The question, I guess, then what it would fall down to, and this is a very classic question of analyzing modern politics, is can that only exist because of the security blanket of the United States? If it was the case the United States wasn't around, would it be the case Germany or Italy or many of the European nations that are a lot more lax on sort of exercising their ability to project power in the way that France has and still does? Would they go back to those old ways of doing things? I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I want to point out, Kraut said earlier that something about how these the two blocs in the Cold War were so big and powerful that they could force other countries to be in their sphere of influence, even against their wishes. But then you know, within a couple of minutes of that, I can't remember which one he said first, but he gave the counterexample of China kind of you know, cozying up to the United States and being used against Russia, right? And it's like if that strategy is even viable, then it kind of implies that things weren't actually working according to the predictive model in the first place. And it seems like the strategy is to take advantage of the situations where the predictive model fails.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating subject, but I just feel like I don't know, maybe this is just the limit of sort of presenting ideas in a digestible format. You'll never be able to encapsulate the necessary nuance when you're dealing with something so complex.
Yeah, and there's hardly any topic more complex that we could even be talking about than this. But anyway, our chatter says if you look at current Russian political thinkers like Dugin, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Dugin. He's far from a realist. He's extremely idealistic. Okay, so.
Oh yeah. I mean, Kraut actually has a whole nother video about sort of the ideology of Russia and sort of Dugin and many other thoughts. Ivan Ilyin Schmidt, and there's a third one who I can't remember. That was just some absolute fucking schizo during the Soviet Union that talked about like Mongol cosmic power. But anyways, but yeah, no, that is very true. I don't think it's true to say that Russia is entirely isn't idealistic. Although, man, with Russia, it's also kind of hard to tell like what are the interests versus what is just like the reliable outcome of having a corrupt oligarchic state where every actor has no ideological interest and is merely self-interested, and how that projects itself. You know, what actions in the Russian state are just the actions of every single person who's a yes man and is just trying to do whatever they can to enrich themselves, versus what represents a legitimate ideology that's held by Putin and his supporters. Even if they are yes men, they want to say yes to Putin's ideology. So yeah, it's really tough. Oh, whoops! I think I played while we were still muted. Anyways.
What did you think about the Kraut's description of the early 20th century ideologies? Because when he talked about communism and fascism, I guess it wasn't totally clear to me whether he was describing communism as idealistic versus realistic, but with fascism it seemed like he was just framing it as entirely realism, and as if they were just like totally trying to disregard, because they were discarding all the ideals of liberalism and, in favor of their own power politics. But I'm not sure I'm actually like satisfied with that framing of it, because I think in their own way they were very idealistic.
Yeah, I think that sort of gets to the question of like what is an ideal versus what is realistic. Like, if you want to get like super philosophical with it, you could say like the choice to the decision to live a life of any kind and not just commit suicide is idealism in and of itself, because nihilist so I think it really starts to get into the question of like where do you ground like your axioms and say, well, I'm just going to choose to believe that this is like a shared framework that doesn't have any burdens versus what doesn't. Like we might say in one context science is unbiased. If I'm talking to a person, he's like, well, I saw this, why should I trust the study? It's like, well, this study is a lot more unbiased compared to but that's the key, compared to just going off of our personal experiences. But of course, even a study itself still has a bias. So I just think it's like really important to constantly be clear with your language and sort of what like philosophical level you're dealing with, because I think like when you do boil it down, everything has to come from some sort of like I don't think there's like you can ever escape like the sort of like subjective like black hole of like decision making or the choices you make.
Because all the choices you make, well, they're going to be informed by a combination of your values plus your I was going to say worldview, but that worldview I think is something that people would use to include both values in. But like your values plus your descriptive beliefs about the world that you live in. Yeah. Those two things are even though they're two different things, they're both necessary ingredients to whatever prescriptions you're going to come up with.
And I guess to be fair, that is, I don't want to speak for you, but at least that's my perspective coming from someone that's, I don't really believe in like moral or philosophical truth. There probably are people who would say, no, actually, for example, like I think it would be fair to characterize Sam Harris would probably say, no, actually, we can come to like logical conclusions about what we ought to do, and from there we can build everything up, so that when that person does ask people, isn't science biased, to be like, no, because we ought to believe in these sorts of things.
Okay, so I think I'm mostly on board with the like no objective moral truth thing, but I want to just like spell out a little bit of more of what I would mean by that, because I think if you specify a certain like value function that you're trying to maximize, and you specify a certain context in which you're trying to apply it, I think you then can have objective truths with regard to like what's the best way to achieve this thing within this context, right? So I think you can have context specific objective moral truths, right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I just don't think they're universalizable because we all come from different contexts and have different values, and it's the difference between those things that I would describe as subjective, and so therefore, like if I had to give my take on this in a single sentence, I would say morality is subjective, not objective, but I think it's like it's like a combination of the two, but it's more like on a granular level it's objective, but on a broader level subjective.
The thing I've always the way I've always described it is I think we can only have our objective discussions on a shared subjective framework. But you then still can absolutely, if we all agree murder is wrong, then we can absolutely have some objective discussions about like, well, maybe we need a police force, maybe that's a good idea. But if you don't share the subjective framework, then that's where things get really tricky, which I think is actually ultimately one of the really good criticisms of like at least my worldview, is I think like you could very easily get me to a point where it's like, it is a very good thing that as humans we actually kind of share like 99% of morality. Like the reality is across all histories and all cultures, there really aren't that many humans that are like, oh yes, I love inflicting misery and stuff like this. Generally, people will try to exclusively draw the line about what they consider to be a human or a person or whatever word we want to use. But within that circle, they generally are still relatively pretty empathetic, as opposed to the true gamut of range, which would be like, oh yeah, that civilization over there, they're the civilization that thinks that all humans should be skinned alive. It's like, and if there really was a significant group of people like that, man, I think that philosophically you can get to some really weird places if you don't believe in moral truth, where it's like, man, we can't interface with these people. We cannot live together. You people need to die or be genocided or, be, put into, some sort of restricted area, but like we fundamentally cannot interface.
Yeah, if you consider only humans as moral agents, then I would agree with you. But if you consider like animals as, to get into this,
I think that really gets to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you actually can find animals whose value system, or at least their behavior, seems to indicate that they really do just embody wanton destruction and cruelty, right? Our chatter says, I think this is a problem with Kraut's narrative around realism, oversimplifying the examples he's pointing to without keeping in mind these power players like presidents aren't exclusively driven by realism, even if they favor it heavily in their policy pursuits. And yeah, I think that's a really good point, because any of these administrations, like even the Nixon administration that they're bringing as the prime example of realism, is going to have competing voices within it, and not only that, but different interpretations of realism and idealism within it, so that there's more than two perspectives, and so it is pretty reductive to just say like, they followed this one school and not the other, even if I can accept it as like an okay first order approximation of what's happening.
Yeah, I guess to be fair, we also haven't even really gotten to a lot of his criticisms yet. We're only 30 minutes in, but yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
Russia. Bush 43 was part of a new conservative political school that evolved from Reagan, the neoconservatives. Believing that Reagan's aggressive idealism had ended the Soviet Union, they advocated for even more aggressive idealism, that America must enforce its ideal globally, and the worst violators must be militarily removed. As much as I want to try to be objective in this video, I think most of us can agree that that one was, in particular, a disaster. Obama was confusing. He basically tried to mix everything. Best example, he was a realist on Assad, who was permitted to massacre entire cities, while being an idealist on Gaddafi for threatening to massacre a city. He supported the Arab Spring, then backed those who undermined it, while doing an Iranian nuclear deal. He claimed to leave Europe to sort out its own affairs, but then he applied a realist foreign policy in Ukraine. Yes, many forget this, despite what Russian propagandists may tell you. In actuality, the Obama administration's policy on Ukraine in 2014 was that Yanukovych should stay in power and that Ukraine should remain in a Russian sphere of influence. Obama basically tried to use every approach and therefore ultimately did not achieve much at all, because his foreign policy lacked focus. Trump
did not achieve the Hegelian synthesis.
Who shunned any and all idealism, but also shunned realist ideas. America had
Trump had no ideas, is what he's trying to say.
But America also should not have a sphere of influence, only money to make through defense contracts and trade deals. His foreign policy soured American relations with her ideals-based allies and empowered the world's authoritarians. I personally would argue that a combination of Obama's misguided realism on Ukraine and Trump's isolationism played substantial roles in encouraging Putin to invade Ukraine. And now we have Biden. It is kind of too soon to tell.
He is being uncharitable to Trump, but
the project of Bush 41. I believe Biden would like the Bush 41 project to be the common bipartisan foreign policy of both American political parties for the rest of this century. Or at least until communist China collapses, since that seems to be its end goal. Realism still exists as a school of foreign relations and geopolitics. It does sometimes get limelight and even influence in American foreign policy. But ever since Reagan, it has to share the table with other foreign policy ideas. In the post-Cold War era, a core tenet of realism has essentially become that the ideologies of the poker players have become irrelevant. The fact that Russia is no longer the Soviet Union is therefore irrelevant. Now that may sound weird to you, but to the modern realist, in many ways, ideology itself is irrelevant, be it the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the modern Russian state. From the realist perspective, these are just flags. They're just symbols representing a great power, or a poker player. In some ways, the ideologies professed by nations are seen as nothing but national makeup, or costumes, trends and fads that change with time, while the underlying geopolitical power struggle never changes. From the realist perspective, ideologies do not matter anymore, and whatever ideologies the rulers of Russia claim to believe are irrelevant, because internal political developments do not matter. What matters from the realist perspective is that Russia is a great power, and that great power has a sphere of influence.
Yep. We got a chatter who hi, King Solomon, by the way. Isn't morality the other side of the coin from instinct, or do you see instinct as morality? My own view on this is that people have a lot of moral intuitions, and then they construct the moral system that they think best justifies their intuitions.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree. I think that instinct or intuition or just your innate feelings are like a big part that your morality comes from, but I don't think it's entirely explanatory. If nothing else, I think this is the one thing that sometimes I do struggle with is I would like to say something like people have feelings that influence their morality, but they also still have logical, rational thoughts of trying to construct a consistent moral system that also influences. So, for example, a person might say, I should care about all people, or I care about all people, therefore humans have moral worth, and then they might use that logic to get somewhere where they find themselves obligated to morally value something that they don't have an instinct to care about or a feeling to care about. But I think something that is difficult to sort of untangle is what if the only reason why people then sort of construct a consistent system is because one of their feelings is that they like the feeling of thinking that they have a consistent and well-constructed system.
Well, that is exactly what I believe. I think it's also driven by like people derive social status and self-esteem from thinking that they're smart or that they have good, like good things to say on topics. Or I think that is what motivates a lot of it.
Yeah. I hope it's not all of it, but it's definitely a big part of it. I don't know. It's something very difficult to think about because I think what the question fundamentally comes down to is actually sort of a descriptive question about how our conscious mind works, which we don't have good answers for, which is like, is there really anything that isn't just your basal feelings? Like, how would you truly distinguish something from being just a feeling you have versus something that you're thinking because in a roundabout way it fulfills your feelings? Like the question would be like, you know, if you, and this is like a sort of a classic like debate about like sort of about like sort of morality itself is like the idea of like virtue signaling is sort of a downstream idea of this, which is that is it ever possible to truly act selfless? Because by taking the act in and of itself, it feels like you're legitimizing it within your feelings. Like, is it actually possible for human beings to ever do something where it's like, I don't want to do this, but I am going to do it? Or is it always going to be entangled in some way? Well, you did it, therefore, it's obviously what your brain wanted to do, ultimately, even if there were reasons against it, right? And I don't know, feels like a question that like we just aren't equipped to answer because it feels like it relies on some descriptive understanding of the human mind.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna try to answer it nevertheless because I have a proposed answer. Okay, so what I think this is like there are two different things going on here, and if you want, you can describe them both as selfish, but they are selfish in different respects. So if I care about something, we could say like what is the mechanism of my caring and what is the object of my caring, and these are the two things I'm trying to separate, right? So if I care about another person and I behave in a way that I believe it will benefit them and that that would typically be described as altruistic. You could say, like, really, I'm selfish because I'm just doing it to make myself feel better. But I think then what you're describing is that the mechanism of my motivation is within myself. But that's different from saying that the object of my caring is within myself, which in this case it's not, right?
Yeah. I think that is a fair distinction. Like, you can probably draw a difference between someone deriving direct like joy or pleasure out of like like a drug versus like sort of some third order. Like, well, they want to be moral, they want to be able to sleep at night and live it themselves, so they do a thing that they don't like because like there's definitely levels to it.
Right. So basically, like the way I kind of look at it is when people say that they're behaving selfishly, the way I interpret that is that both the mechanism of their caring and the object of their caring are themselves. But I think you can behave selflessly in the sense that even though you are guided by your own internal feelings, you are doing it with respect to a feeling about something that is not yourself, and that is what people mean when they say they're being unselfish. That's my proposed answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that. I think to have a proper response, but I definitely think I'm very close to that position, no doubt.
All right. Hopefully we answered your question, Solomon.
Ought to respect in order to find a balance of powers. And because of that, when looking at the war in Ukraine from the realist perspective, it is the United States who violated the balance of powers by infringing on the Russian sphere of influence through the advancing of democracy in Ukraine. Over the course of the last year, ever since the Russians invaded, and ever since people started posting Mersheimer clips or repeating his talking points, I have no doubt that we have all seen many enraged Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Belarusians, Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians,
not so much the Belarusians,
who find realist talks, including those of Mersheimer, to be almost offensive. I am sure there are some of you in the audience right now as well. From the perspective of Mersheimer, all of you are in a Russian sphere of influence. And because of that, for America to maintain a balance of powers with Russia, it is in the interest of the United States that Russia gets to have a say in your politics. European realists are also outraged by this. From their realist perspective, Russia has no place in European politics. But European realists often forget that Mersheimer is not a European realist. He is an American realist. Mersheimer argues from a position of wanting to preserve an American hegemony as the great power of the Western Hemisphere. And from that perspective, America should try to preserve the status quo of the Cold War. And what you, the European realist, thinks is irrelevant. Mersheimer does not consider Europe to be a poker player, but merely a bunch of poker chips to be divided between the American and Russian spheres of influence. So, I hope this description of what realism was objective and accurate. If you believe I failed, you should feel free to point that out in the comments. I look forward to reading them. But with that explanation out of the way, there is something that I need to address, something that is somewhat of an elephant in the room. and it mainly has to do with you, the subscribers. Namely, those of you who asked me to make this video. And that is because most of you specifically asked me to make this video in response to Marxist pundits, publications, and politicians who started repeating realist talking points and posting Mearsheimer clips. I will not do that. I'm sorry, but I believe that doing that would be a waste of time. And if you have watched this video so far, you will probably understand why. These Marxist pundits are basically promoting a political theory that has its origins in American Cold War politics and that argues for an American hegemony over a sphere of influence. And I'm pretty sure that most of them are too stupid to even understand that.
Oh, man.
If you actually look into what Mearsheimer proposes, and not just watch selected clips through confirmation bias, you will find that the reason he opposes Western support to Ukraine is because he believes the Americans should concede Eastern Europe to becoming a Russian sphere of influence as part of a deal America can make with Russia as an alliance against China. I think many Marxist pundits that have posted Mearsheimer clips recently or repeated his talking points don't realize that Mearsheimer is by no means left-wing, but belongs to a political school of old-school conservative American Cold War warriors, a la Nixon and Kissinger. Back during the Cold War era, Marxists were in fact some of the harshest critics of realism. They described realism as little more than a thin veneer to disguise imperialism. The very fact that Marxists these days are repeating realist talking points is an absurdity. These modern Marxist pundits of our day and age, to illustrate just how clownish this is, are literally advocating.
I think this is really, really uncharitable. And because I think, okay, I haven't listened to the Marxist videos he's talking about, just to be clear, like maybe I'm totally misreading what's happening here, but the way it sounds to me like is he's saying it's an absurdity because it doesn't cohere with their own point of view, right? But it's quite often the case that people make arguments from the point of view of the audience, and they're saying like, look, you guys, the believers in realism, have people among you who say that even by realist standards, like, this is a bad idea. And I think it's totally plausible for a Marxist to make that argument, and it's not absurd for them to do it. It's just they're, you know, not everything they say has to be framed in terms of their own point of view. It does make sense to consider their audience, right?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those discussions that's really hard to have because it ultimately comes down to, like, there's a bunch of people saying a bunch of different things. There's no doubt some, and maybe this is just my sample size, but I have absolutely seen sort of what Kraut is describing, which is people being like, look, like, Mearsheimer realism is true, and they're just sort of saying that because, you know, they don't like the U.S., and they do not agree with sort of the underlying logic that gets you to those conclusions, which would lead them to, you know, things that they don't like, you know, which is like, you know, justifying all of, you know, the stuff the U.S. did with Latin America, for example, during the Cold War. I have seen a lot of that, but there's no doubt there's also Marxists that are doing that, which is why it's kind of hard, like, to actually tease out, like, how many are saying that versus how many are saying the other thing. It's really difficult.
Yeah, so generally speaking, I think it is true that people start with the conclusion they want to reach, and then they just, like, construct justifications that they think best support it, right? So I think that that's just, like, basically everybody does that. But so in that sense, I agree with what you just said. It's just like, you know, like I was saying earlier about being charitable to different points of view. I think it makes a lot of sense to say that what other people are pointing towards, even if it doesn't perfectly makes sense at face value or seems to contradict something else they say, it still may be gesturing in the general direction of something informative, and therefore if I, you know, interpret what they say a little more loosely, there might be some value to it, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense to just say it's absurd because it contradicts something else that this person's saying, even though they're not bringing it up in that context.
I think, I don't know, it's tough. There's a phrase that I have from debate that is really useful for this kind of thing, and that's a question of how much work does a judge do for one side or another. Because in many debates, you know, someone will be like, the judge will be like, oh, I voted against you, I voted for the other person. It's like, no, my argument, you know, if you run it down to its conclusion, the judge's like, no, but you have to run it down to that conclusion. But where exactly is, like, you know, if I say A equals B and B equals C, do I need to spell out A equals C, or can the judge safely do that for me? So that idea of how much work do you do trying to interpret and run to the logical conclusion of an argument, I think is a really interesting one, because if you go too far, obviously, you will, be, creating positions that don't even exist. I think this sometimes happens with, like, Jordan B. Peterson is a classic one, where I think sometimes people really go sort of bend their back backwards to justify, what I think are some really dumb things that he says, especially in the realms of, like, politics. But on the other hand, you do need to have some level of charitability, because no one is ever saying, I think, and of course by I think, I'm referring to myself as much as I know, and my mind as much as I know, of course, under the context that I can't know anything, because the Descartes like, you have to have something. So I think it's a balance. And I guess just for me personally, in the interactions that I've had, and again, maybe I've got a bad sample size, the conversations I've had do very much feel like they're falling to the column of endorsing, of not saying, oh, look, Mearsheimer's on your side, or, you realists ought believe this, but saying Mearsheimer is right about this, endorsing the logic by which he gets that conclusion, which would lead them to the conclusions that they very vehemently disagree. It felt, I don't know if you're familiar with the term of, like, selective libertarianism, or like selective skepticism, but I think I've literally heard someone say, like, selective realism. And at least in my experience, I have run into a lot of that online, but that might just be a huge selection bias, because I go talk with and yell at stupid people all the time. So.
Okay, so it didn't sound to me like Kraut was just saying some Marxists, or a lot of Marxists, are making this mistake where they selectively believe in realism without realizing that it doesn't cohere with the rest of their worldview. Like, I mean, I think that's part of what he's saying, but it seemed to me like he was saying, not explicitly, but it seemed to me like he was implying there is no way that a Marxist could accept what Krautheimer's saying because it intrinsically conflicts with their idealistic worldview. And I think that is uncharitable.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure. I think I would need to listen more to see if I was to sort of suss that out.
Okay. King Solomon says, I think of morality as a temper to our instinct, and that's what separates us from the animals. So when you mentioned the possibility of animal morality, I was curious as to what you meant. Okay, so what I meant by that is okay, we were talking about Sam Harris like 15 minutes ago, and Sam Harris like will frame his morality in terms of like I think the way he puts it is like the well-being of conscious creatures or something like that is the way he talks about it, right? And I've heard of other people try to do a similar thing where they'll try to define their morality in terms of like human well-being or something like that, right? And then like I was kind of responding to something that Flowtrace was saying where it's like, okay, like we can assume 99% of the time that other humans have, some of the same core values that we have. People generally aren't just in favor of cruelty and suffering and murder, and therefore, like, if we're constructing a moral framework to apply to humans, then it makes a lot of sense to look at what are the values that humans have in common. And I guess what I was trying to point out was the choice of only including humans in that value system is somewhat arbitrary, and it's something that not everybody agrees on, right? Like a lot of vegans, like our friend Section, who we haven't talked to in a while, this is a guy who would claim that that cats are murderers because they predate on weaker animals, right? And he considers them like moral agents. I'm not sure if he would say they're equivalent to humans, but they're at least like in the same conversation as like they can be, guilty of a moral transgression in the same way that a human can. And so, like, I think if you're that kind of person who's willing to consider consider including other creatures that might have vastly different psychology from what humans have, then at that point it no longer makes sense to say that our moral framework can be built on this assumption that we have shared values with the vast majority of other humans, because now like if our moral framework has to include the values of not only humans but like fire ants. It just doesn't make that much sense to say that they have almost anything in common with us, like in terms of their values, besides just they want to eat and not be killed.
Yeah, I think the deeper sort of just my 2 cents on that is sort of getting back to the question of how do you sort that out. What is is our desire to temper our instinct, not an instinct in and of itself. I think that's like that's like the crux of like the knot that is that we don't have the ability to disentangle.
Mm-hmm.
For the Foreign Policy School, that is the cause of the Cuban blockade and Pinochet's coup. You may now understand why I believe that it would be a waste of time to address them or to make this video about them. They are either too stupid to understand what they are advocating, or they are just cynical. When Noam Chomsky, Jeremy Corbyn and Jean-Luc Mélenchon suddenly started arguing a realist position the moment Russia...
Wait, why did they say Jeremy Corbyn's name like that? Wait, what? Am I crazy?
Jeremy Corbyn and Jean-Luc...
Oh, no, sorry, he did them out of order in terms of the picture to the name.
A realist position the moment Russia invaded Ukraine. I believe the only time you should waste on them is by pointing out that they are entirely dishonest and cynical. They themselves used to argue against realism, especially concerning the Cuban blockade. If you want to make sense of why they do this, I think you will get a far better insight by looking into something that Chomsky did in 2014. Back then he was given an award for his linguistics work by a Czech university. He then toured the Czech Republic to give various talks. During these, he said that the Czechs suffered far less than the South Americans during their military dictatorships, basically arguing that the Czechs were exaggerating how much they suffered under their communist dictatorship and the Soviet occupation. Chomsky, in describing Czech history, magically begins in the 1960s and cuts out the Stalinist era of the 1940s and 50s, during which tens of thousands of Czechs were murdered, as if it never happened. He claimed that the only reason Czech anti-communist dissidents became popular in Czechia was because of an American propaganda conspiracy, that figures such as Václav Havel were basically agents of American imperialism, that they were hypocrites and not true revolutionaries because they were friendly with the United States. Basically, all of Czech history since 1945, the communist coup, the Stalinist purges, the Prague Spring, the thousands murdered and tortured, the period of stagnation, and the struggles of those who resisted it all of it is swept away as one gigantic irrelevancy by Chomsky in one big whataboutism. One can paraphrase Chomsky's attitude towards the Czech people basically with a, I will conveniently erase and ignore the suffering you endured throughout your history, demean and belittle those who resisted your oppressors, and in the end ask, but what about something South America, because you Eastern Europeans are irrelevant brats who are just ungrateful for what the benevolent Soviet Union did for you. If you are European like
not myself, a good look.
You probably just know that this is something that you should just not say. Saying something like this to Czechs or Slovaks is just insulting, demeaning, offensive, and an immoral revisionist assault on their identity and self-understanding through their history. Most of us here in Europe know that 30,000 Czechs were murdered under a Soviet occupation, that thousands more were arrested. We know what the Prague Spring was, and how traumatic the Prague Spring and the period of Soviet occupation was for the Czechs. Saying something like what Chomsky said is just out of touch, tone deaf, and offensive. And I think that this is the key to understanding people like him. What people like Chomsky say here, or Corbyn, when he keeps referring to Ukraine as the Ukraine, as if it were still a Russian imperial subject, may remind European viewers of something else. German viewers may be reminded of a certain type of old German who, during conversations about the Second World War, says things like, well, at least Hitler built the Autobahn, or, well, the Poles also did bad things to us, yeah, and try to misrepresent the Second World War as a war of Polish aggression against a supposedly benevolent Nazi Germany. Or French viewers may be reminded of a certain type of old Frenchman who rambles about how the Algerians are just supposedly ungrateful people who do not appreciate all the great benevolent things the French did for them when thousands of Algerians were burnt alive in their villages by French napalm bombs. And British viewers may be more familiar with a type of old Brit rambling about the ungrateful Indians who do not appreciate that Britain brought them civilization through famines or something. I believe it is more helpful to understand people like Chomsky, Corbyn and Mélenchon by comparing them to people like that. Western Marxists had a vested interest in the continuation of the Soviet bloc as an ideological competitor to the Western bloc. They believed that the revolution may still come to the West and that the Communist bloc may help facilitate such. But then, the Eastern Europeans dashed these dreams when they did a revolution, ironically against communism, which was supposed to be impossible. Many Western Marxists have never forgiven Eastern Europeans for ending communist tyranny in Europe. I think some Eastern Europeans may not even be aware of that. Your history, your struggles, your cultural identity, your political developments, those are all irrelevant to many Western Marxists. Most of them don't even speak a single one of your languages. The only thing that matters to them is that you committed that cardinal sin in 1989. To them, you are just traitors and ungrateful brats. It is for these reasons that this segment of this video is so short. I know that some of you specifically asked me to critique Marxists who are throwing around realist talking points since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I will not do that. I will argue against the realism of Mearsheimer and Morgenthau because those are genuine realists. I do not believe for a single second that people like Chomsky, Corbyn, or Mélenchon are genuine realists. Realists' talking points to them are just temporary rhetorical devices used in a disingenuous way. They are not motivated out of any genuine political principle or theory, but out of a spiteful grudge held against the peoples of Eastern Europe.
I think you could respond to them at face value, even if you don't believe that they're motivated sincerely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Old British person who claims that Indians do not appreciate what the British Empire supposedly did for them is that the British Empire is dead, and that is a good thing. Now get over it, Grandpa. And in that same vein, the only thing you should say to a Chomsky or a Corbyn is that the Soviet Union is dead, and that is a good thing. Now get over it, Grandpa. So, before I end this segment and go into my critiques of realism, I kind of want to end this segment by quoting someone. Alexander Vondra. He was a Czech dissident during the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, a leader of the Velvet Revolution, a Czech diplomat who spearheaded the process of historical reconciliation and agreements of future friendship between Poland and Czechia, and is currently a Czech representative in the European Parliament. When Chomsky called people like him cowards in 2014, Alexander Vondra responded with the following. I cannot understand how anybody can respect the reasoning of this poor man. In our country in particular. During the same days when Václav Havel was serving time in a communist prison cell because he advocated for basic democratic values, Chomsky was sitting around Boston cafes, penning articles in full support of Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia. If the world continues to listen to the bullshitting of such people with an intellectual admiration, we will once again end up in gulags and concentration camps. Now, the next segment are my critiques.
That's a pretty forceful statement.
First,
yeah, Kraut really doesn't like Chomsky. I think he actually has a whole video called "Why Noam Chomsky is Trash" that I'm pretty sympathetic to.
I haven't seen that video, but that's an opinion that I've been sympathetic to for quite a long time. Is that Chomsky is a really smart person who doesn't seem to recognize the limits of his own expertise. And I think this is something that a lot of smart people fall prey to, is that they just start speaking on topics that they don't know much about, but because they're so used to succeeding within their own sphere, that they I don't know, and maybe they're even like really strong communicators and good at presenting themselves as if they have expertise in other spheres, and you know, are therefore good at rallying people behind their opinions, and just don't know what they're talking about when they talk about these things. And you know, Jordan Peterson, another pretty good example of that, like a person
I was going to say Elon Musk too.
So yeah, people who have, you know, I'm not even sure if about the genuine expertise of Elon Musk. I don't want to speak on that one, but at least with respect to Jordan Peterson and Noam Chomsky, these are people who, by all accounts, have some you know, genuine expertise and good contributions within their particular academic field, and who nevertheless often swerve way out of their lane to say wild stuff outside of that field and don't seem to realize the mistake they're making when they do it. And yeah.
Yep.
Ayatollah disapproves. Ayatollah Khomeini's Iranian Revolution and the resistance against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were challenges to the bipolar Cold War order that left both sides and their Cold War rationales blindsided. Here, a political system emerged that wished to side with neither participants in the supposed global game of poker. But Islamism also refused to play poker and deliberately played by its own rules outside of the framework of realism. In other words, it was neither a poker chip nor a poker player. It was completely outside of the rationale. Confusing? Let me explain. Realism, as previously explained, is a theory built on the idea of conflict through the striving for power between nation-states. But the political forces unleashed by Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and then further spread throughout various movements and religious sects are forces to whom the nation-state does not matter.
Yeah, these are counterexamples to the three principles that
political Islam
yep.
is a set of beliefs and system of political organization and institutions that completely disregards the nation-state. It is a system of social organization and political power that seamlessly crosses modern sovereign borders with no regard for any boundaries set by nation-states and any rules of engagement between nation-states. It is a system of politics that exists outside of the concept of the nation-state and can therefore effortlessly operate from outside of the nation-state's constraints. To this very day, no foreign policy theory of engagement by anyone has found a way to effectively confront Islamism as a political force. The main reason is that Islamism is based on ideas and not just
a cultural force, not a political one.
To counter ideas, you must confront them with opposing ideas. Additionally, realism.
I think it's a cultural force that then causes political force. But I think that's how like a fundamental. It reminds me of I think one of the only good back when I was back when I was of a different political persuasion, I was a big fan of Milo Yiannopoulos, and I remember one of the only good articles he ever wrote was basically, and I'm sure it's not actually that good of an article, but there was a core idea in the article, which is that the fight against radical Islam needs to not just be a military fight, but a cultural fight, a fight of ideas. And he sort of analogized it to the sort of not just military, but ideological fight against communism. The idea that, like, for example, like blue jeans were actually like a huge, like, big thing. The idea that, you know, people wanted to be on our side, not their side. And you sometimes see that, you know, with a lot of the recruitments that, you know, these organizations make, particularly from people in the West, are usually from very disaffected people.
Yeah, so if you can analogize the fight against Islamism to the fight against communism during the Cold War, which I think you can, I think that it's an analogy that pretty much works, then isn't that actually a point of similarity between Islamism and these more nationalistic political ideologies?
I think it is in a certain sense, but I think what that captures is that actually even within the nation state, even within the example of the Soviet Union, there's a lot of stuff going under the hood that realism doesn't take into account for. Like, for example, the fall of the Soviet Union. It didn't fall because it made any misplays in the game of politics of its poker chips. It fell because the people internally within the nations were not the nations that it controlled were not monolithic entities. They actually had genuine disagreements, and they lost that cultural battle. So I think I think it actually demonstrates sort of the limits of that ideology. Like Kraut said sort of at the beginning of the video, one of the theorists that thought, you know, the Soviet Union was just going to be a fact of life for, you know, the next couple hundred years. That sort of demonstrates, I think that demonstrates the limits of applying realism even in its own arena, let alone the arena of like Islamism.
Okay, so I'm generally inclined to agree with what you're saying. I think it's true that the Soviet bloc, or the Soviet leadership, lost a cultural battle against their own people within their own bloc, and that this has a lot to do with their collapse. However, I think somebody who is really into realism would probably not concede that that's the case. I think they might point to things like, well, the Soviet Union actually did make a bunch of missteps in international politics, and so, for example, they had a very costly war in Afghanistan where they were, you know, that was very expensive to them, and that they got mired in for quite a long time, and then they failed to build an economically sustainable bloc that could successfully compete with the West, and so on. I mean,
yeah, I think they might make that argument, but I think I would really disagree with them, and that's going to come down to why did, you know, states like Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, Poland, why did they, you know, rise up and change for one reason or another? And you'd have to get into that debate. And I think it has a lot more to do with sort of the internal politics than it does with the power politics.
Our chatter says they simply lost the mandate of heaven. True.
Right? That's the real answer.
Yeah. But okay, so I still, like, I generally agree with what you're saying. I think the internal cultural battle that they were fighting probably had more to do with it. But I think the kind of pro-realist steel man that I was trying to do a minute ago does have some truth to it, right? Like the Soviet Union did in some ways struggle on the international stage, and even in this video, they were talking about how they kind of had China leveraged against them, so somebody that could theoretically have been on their side, and India was kind of tepid as an ally, and it seems like they just didn't actually succeed on the international stage just as much, and I have to think that even though they were fighting a cultural battle at home, I think their failure to project power successfully probably did weaken them at home. It consumed a lot of their resources, to go back to when we were talking about Qing era China. Like they had their priorities set in such a way that didn't leave them well equipped to fight that cultural battle.
I think it's a contributing factor, but I think it's actually quite minor in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I don't. Quite minor sounds to me like it's overstating it, but I still probably agree with you more than I disagree.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's a pretty strong position for me to stake out. I'm not intimately familiar with that. That's the kind of thing I want to go brush up on before I stake a stronger position. But it's my feeling, based off of what I do know and what I have previously looked into, that it has a lot more to do with sort of the internal politics than it does with anything external. But yeah, I think we still mostly agree.
Yeah, so then with respect to Islamism, I think you could conceive of it as something that competes with nation states in a way that could make it in some ways functionally equivalent to a nation state, right? It's a how do I put it? It's something that's competing for people's loyalty in much the same way that does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does have some similarities. It's like a Venn diagram. It's not like it's completely dissimilar, but I think the ways, it's almost like a foil. The ways in which it is different, I think, highlight some of the limits of realism in terms of descriptively and predictively analyzing what is true and what isn't.
Yeah, and I think when realism goes to right at the beginning to predict that people are just going to behave in a self-interested way to pursue for their own security and power, it does make a lot of sense. I mean, actually, this was one of the first critiques that you brought up toward the beginning of this video, was like, but that's not actually how people behave all the time, right? Like, people really are motivated a lot by their ideals, cultural or otherwise. Yep. And I think Islamism is one of the prime examples of this.
Built on a foundation of conflict between nation states is utterly useless in confronting political institutions like Islamism, which do not rely on and are not built upon the concept of the nation state. When confronted with Islamism, realism has helped bring forth some weird curiosities in American foreign policy, such as its alliance with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, theocracies that from the realist perspective may be an American ally, but also actively work on undermining and attacking the American sphere of influence through means that are not bound to nation-state concepts of power games, and therefore cannot be confronted or contained by the strategies and policies of realism. Islamism spreads and builds upon a foundation of an immaterial belief, God and his supposed cause. Because it is based on faith, Islamism in political terms transcends the nation-state. Nation-state concepts of power such as professional armies, diplomatic rules of engagement, military rules of engagement, or commercial treaties do not matter. The Islamist movement can randomly assemble power from outside of the confines of nation-states from various different national and cultural backgrounds and make moves that violate any and all diplomatic norms. It can set up its base in any power vacuum and also does not care about the rules of engagement between nation-state concepts. Modern Islamism proves that ideologies matter. We do not just strive for raw power and for the exercising of that raw power. No, people strive to act out what they genuinely believe, and Islamism also proves that the nation-state is not the sole force of politics in our modern world. Second, the self-fulfilling prophecy. To most of you who have watched my previous videos, the fact that I am a critic of realism is probably not surprising. I am largely an adherent of institutional economics. I believe that the most deciding factor in political development are institutions, ergo the internal political developments of societies. Institutional economics is about the study of laws, social contracts, and economic structures of the past and present societies to develop policies to improve societies based on what is proven to work through observation and examination. Anyone who studies the development of institutions and believes that there is such a thing as political development by either progress or regression through policy will inevitably come into conflict with the schools of thought spawned by the crisis of modernity. And that includes realism. My biggest gripe with realism is that to the realist, internal developments do not matter and are irrelevant. It is very tempting to adopt offensive realism when looking at the world of geopolitics, to see the world like a nation-building strategy video game. The idea that one can base foreign policy on hard-boiled, rational, and almost mathematical calculations or on predictive models.
I think this is Kraut just endorsing the exact thing you said like 10 minutes ago about the Soviet Union, basically.
Yeah, probably.
Built on observed behaviors, as most modern economists do. Doing so provides a sense of certainty and security. But the way realists boil down politics to nothing more than analyzing power dynamics reminds me of something else. In economics, there is a phenomenon called physics envy. This is when economists pursue the goal of
so fucking funny.
Success of failure.
I've heard the term before, yeah, it is funny.
Rational calculations with predictive power that mimic the predictive power of theories in the natural sciences and ultimately fail.
I have heard this applied to psychology.
Provides a sense of security, but it is ultimately a false sense of security. Numerous economic theories have been built in attempts to create rational mathematical formulas or behavioral models for economic success, which, however, ignored an incalculable or overlooked social factor and therefore failed to predict an economic crash. To ignore internal social, cultural, and political developments, as realists demand one does, is certain to, and has in the past, ignored enormous social variables that completely disrupt the equation. One of the most glaring things about the previous example of the emergence of Islamism as a political force is that realism was entirely unable to predict it, not because of a miscalculation through the use of the formula or the pursuit of power among nation states, but because the formula itself is flawed, because it fails to account for internal development. Internal political development, be it cultural, political, demographic, geographic, technological or other, is one of the most deciding factors in understanding geopolitical developments. And many conflicts, which realists would like to explain away as a mere pursuit of power by nation states, are in fact the result of internal developments. One of the pre-Cold War statesmen, much admired by realists, is Metternich, the foreign minister and de facto ruler of the Habsburg Empire during and after the Napoleonic era. Through a hard-boiled calculated application of power politics, Metternich managed to become the most powerful statesman in Europe and secure a balance of powers in post-Napoleonic Europe. But from Metternich also comes his famous quote, "You can do many things with a bayonet, but you cannot sit on it." Metternich presided over a police state that attempted to crush and subdue any revolutionary nationalist political sentiment, which happened to be the preeminent force of internal political development of that age. And to do so, he needed a bayonet, which was his police state. But he could never sit on that bayonet. His police state had to continuously subdue internal political developments expressed through the desires of the German people to have a unified nation state, and the various ethnic groups of the empire to have their own nation states. These political developments kept boiling beneath Metternich's bayonet like under a pressure cooker until they finally blew up in 1848, a year of Europe-wide nationalist revolutions known as the Spring of Nations. The Spring of Nations, in return, spawned numerous conflicts, most prominent among which are the German Wars for Unification with Austria, Denmark and France, the Balkan Wars for Independence, Balkan nationalist wars over territory, a Hungarian uprising, several Polish uprisings, the Italian Risorgimento, or Wars for Unification, and they may have also contributed to Arab uprisings against the Ottoman Empire. I would argue that the realist claim of the world inherently being a place of inevitable conflict is in some ways merely a self-fulfilling prophecy in a circular logic that spawns that conflict through its own
Can we pause here
policy,
for a second?
by ignoring or even...
I want to just read this diagram to sort of put it in context of what he's saying before he moves on. Ignore internal development as irrelevant to causing international conflict leads to internal development causes international conflict. Okay, so this is happening because it was ignored. It like rises up and causes conflict. Okay. Then from there, solely focus on geopoliticization of any international conflict. Uh, I don't know why that would result from the internal development.
I think the idea, I think the what to use an example, what Kraut is saying is that when you don't focus on internal development, the outcome of that is some sort of geopolitical conflict, which then is the big like flashy thing that you look at. Oh my God, how do we prevent this? So you focus on that, which then cyclically leads you to once again neglect the true cause. It's like focusing on symptoms, right? It's like you have a disease of internal change. You ignore the disease because you don't care about disease, you care about people dying. Then people get a fever, so you're from the disease, but because the big flashy thing is the symptoms of the disease, not the disease itself, that's what you focus on, which then causes you to again neglect the disease or diseases of the future, i.e. future internal developments.
Okay, so then the thing written on the left and the thing written on the top, aren't those two almost exactly the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any more to say about it, I guess.
Subduing internal political development in favor of seeking a balance of powers on a global stage, it enforces a social stagnation that hinders political development, thereby leaving the demand for political development to boil like under a pressure cooker, to later explode, to create the very world of conflict that realists insist isn't caused by the process of internal political development that they so deem as irrelevant. Third, the death of communism. I bet most realists are sick and tired of this, but I had to bring this one up. I'm sorry. But yeah, the era of offensive realism being the predominant force of American foreign policy ended when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War came to an end. Ever since, realism has mostly been confined to being mainly an academic topic of discussion in the field of international politics and in political science. And many realists today put a lot of effort into rebuilding the credibility.
We do pre-watched so hard. Oh my God.
This is because the collapse of the Soviet Union disproved the core tenet of the realist theory, namely that
we're just that
good,
an
inevitability, and that the world would continuously find itself in a state of game of power between leading nation states. Remember Kissinger's justification for his...
Or that ideologically captured by Kraut's faction.
Conflict with the Soviet Union for centuries to come, and therefore had to enforce a balance of powers. That was proven false. Previously, I pointed out that ideologies matter. This point is reiterated here through the striving of the various peoples of Eastern Europe to be liberated from the tyranny of communism. But it also shows that the failures of ideologies matters, and that in some ways, the failure of empires and the failure of imperialism matters. The way communism died, collapsing on its internal contradictions, by being unable to provide a decent living standard, or even just basic dignity to its peoples, on a socio-economic system that was pretty much in decline since the 1970s, showed that nothing about a possible end of communism was an illusion, but in fact something that was desirable and very much achievable. In the end, the idea that the Soviet Union would continue as a geopolitical threat for centuries was the actual illusion. What followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in Europe was an unprecedented era of democratization, peace, and stability, an era in which European nations were able to engage in political development outside of their role of being supposedly American poker chips. And the only reason why we are seeing a return of war to Europe right now is because Russia wants to turn Europe into poker chips, and not because Europe is a bunch of poker chips. The Europeans created the European Union, an institution whose existence is meant to destroy the balance of power games that has drawn this continent into so many catastrophic wars. Rather than striving for spheres of influence and balances of power, European nation-states are encouraged to reconcile, overcome historic enmities, and cooperate. A process successful between Germany and France, Germany and Poland, Germany and the Netherlands, Poland and Ukraine, Italy and Greece, Greece and Bulgaria, Czechia and Poland. Many American realists either pretend the European Union does not exist, argue for its dissolution, or predict its imminent collapse and return to a Cold War era American sphere of influence. There's a good reason for this. The idea of a national corporation between the poker chips outside of a sphere of influence tears the realist idea of a great poker game of power to shreds. Cold War realists therefore often have contempt for transnational organizations like the European Union, Mercosur, ASEAN, or the African Union. To many Europeans,
I don't actually know
like
all
the
of
European
those.
Union,
Google them. Okay, Mercosur. What is that?
I don't know what that one is. I know what the other two are. They're one of them is like a Southeast Asian thing, and another one is like a trans-African economic union.
Let's see here. Mercosur, the Southern Common Market, commonly known by the Spanish abbreviation Mercosur and Portuguese Mercosul, is a South American trade bloc established by the Treaty of by a treaty. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce it. In 1991, and the Protocol of I can't pronounce that either. In 1994, its full members are Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Venezuela. It is a full member, but has been suspended since the 1st of December 2016. Associate countries are Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, and Suriname. Okay.
ASEAN, or the African Union.
I know those.
To many Europeans, the political lessons learned from the
Treaty
end
of Asunción
is that geopolitical power systems, or spheres of influence and great power, are something to oppose and dismantle. And to those who cannot make sense of geopolitics without these, this idea is often something they just can't get over. Ironically, the realist reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to propose a continuation of realist foreign policy by artificially continuing the potential for conflict between nations and great powers. Some of those proposals were just outright bizarre, to say the least, such as a proposal to artificially prop up and continue the Warsaw Pact to ensure two different competing geopolitical power blocs in Europe, who could then continue to vie for power in Europe and thereby create an artificial balance of powers in Europe between East and West. Basically, a demand to create a potential for conflict and war in Europe, not for any real ideological purpose, but just so that the game of power can continue forever, no matter the cost. Or a really bizarre proposal by John Mersheimer in 1990 to give an arsenal of nuclear weapons to a unified Germany to create an artificial balance of power between European nuclear powers. Yes, this was actually proposed. This is not a joke. He actually proposed this. Basically to recreate the geopolitical environment that led to the First World War.
Okay, this just sounds comically stupid. Like, surely. I mean, I feel like one of the core principles of nuclear proliferation is the idea that if more actors have control over nuclear weapons, like, the greater the risk there is of, like, a miscalculation. That just, I mean, what? I mean, man, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yes. No, actually, I was kind of going to go on a different tangent, so if you got something to say first, go.
Yeah, I was going to say, sounds really, really dumb, because the problem is that if there's any miscalculation, it could escalate into like an impact that is far greater than any previous like great power conflict. So I really think this is kind of a crazy thing to believe, but I don't know, maybe I assume John Mearsheimer, even though I disagree with him, is a smart guy, so maybe there's a good reason for this.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a bad idea to me too. But anyway, the thing I was going to say was that Kraut said something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, where he was saying like these people wanted to create an artificial balance of power to perpetuate the risk of conflict no matter the cost, right? But I'm pretty sure somebody who is a realist believes that the cost of that situation is lower because they believe that power struggle is more stable and less likely to lead to conflict, right?
Yeah, I think the key is that when Kraut says perpetuate, it kind of loads it with the idea that it is new. Whereas a realist would say, yes, I'm perpetuating it, but I am decreasing its intensity because it will always be perpetuated. So it might as well be perpetuated in a way that we control it and that is going to lower the risk of it actually causing conflict.
Yeah. So I guess what bothered me about that is it seemed like he was switching from two different points of view within the same sentence, right? It was like they're trying to create this balance of power no matter the cost, but it's like the balance of power is what they want, but no matter the cost is not something that they believe about it. It's something that he believes about their belief, but then he's like saying it in such a way that like they just don't care if it leads to World War III with it. Like,
yeah, I think there is a charitable way to interpret what Kraut is saying, insofar as, you know, this is how I would describe what they are doing.
Yeah.
Because I think they're fundamentally fundamentally wrong. But it does bear it does bear noting the fact that from their perspective, they are not perpetuating anew. They are just perpetuating what will always be perpetuated, and by perpetuating it in this way, it will be better than if it was perpetuated in a different way, from their perspective.
Yeah, like they presumably believe that we're more likely to have lasting peace and less conflict if under their scenario that, you know. Mm-hmm.
But with nuclear weapons, and promising that it won't lead to war because there's nuclear weapons. Oh, God. Well, not one realist assumed that European democratization and integration as a process for peace and stability in Europe could actually work. But so far, that process of European integration has proven them wrong. Realism is a foreign policy doctrine of the past. It served in ages of empires and the Cold War. Continuing a realist foreign policy after the Cold War in a post-imperial age would be like for a patient to continue taking addictive painkillers long after the patient has already recovered from a painful injury. Fourth, the empire's missing cloves. This is a point that sort of is an addition to the previous point. Something that is often overlooked today is that the Soviet Union was an empire, and that there's important insights to gain from viewing its history as the history of an empire. All empires are built on lies, and I am not just saying this as some wishy-washy rhetorical device. Empires are built on political fictions, and it is the preservation of these fictions that serve as the justification for empire that all empires invest in. No empire can give you a satisfactory answer to a very simple question. Why? As in, why are you an empire? Or what, to be more precise, gives you the right to subjugate and rule over others? Examine the political foundations of almost all empires in history, and you will never get any satisfactory answer.
The fact that they can exist without answering the question, implies that they don't need to answer that question.
Ironically, the Marxists of the Cold War era had a really good point when they dismissed realism as little more than a thin veneer to disguise imperialism. The same question that you can ask from an empire, you can also ask from a realist. Why should there be great powers? Why should some nation-states merely be poker chips? How do you decide who gets to be a great power? What are the factors that make a great power? Think of Vietnam. Yes, many realists protested the American war in Vietnam, but I believe that a mistake that even those realists made was to see Vietnam as little more than a poker chip that was played by great power poker players. To realists who opposed the Vietnam War, Vietnam was seen as a Chinese poker chip, and therefore they argued that the Americans have to pull out and leave this poker chip for China. But right after the Americans left Vietnam, China invaded Vietnam because Vietnam refused to be a Chinese poker chip. Are countries really poker chips? As we have seen in almost all earlier examples, as much as you may like to assume that some countries are merely poker chips in a game of great powers, almost all countries will universally refuse to be poker chips. And this goes as far back as the Malian dialogue. From the Malians to the Vietnamese, throughout history, idealism consistently persists despite the ambitions of power of those that disregard idealism. Most claims to great power today are built either on claims of ideology or on claims of history. The United States claimed to be the great power of democracy and almost instantly drove that claim into an Iraqi ditch. What possible humanitarian or geopolitical reason could there still be to continue the blockade of Cuba? It is in our day and age really just an unnecessary cruelty. The Chinese claim to be the great power with influence over much of Southeast Asia is based on a bunch of century-old maps, as if nobody else has ever drawn maps before. Some of the most prolific cartographers of the past were medieval Moroccans, so by the standards of China, Morocco has a historical right to rule the entire Mediterranean. The Chinese stories of history of fraternal peoples with Uyghurs and Tibetans is just as much of a hollow fiction as Habsburg fictions of fraternity with the Czech people. And then there's Russia. Russia is an empire state, that being a nation state that attempts to preserve the borders of an empire. And it does so during a time and in a region of dead empires. Russia's claim to spheres of influence in Eastern Europe are in part built on fictions of fraternal peoples that are just as hollow as other fictions of fraternal peoples, but by and large Russia claims that history is the judge that decreed Russia to be a great power. Well, what does history tell us about great powers in Eastern Europe? Turn back the clock 200 years, and the predominant great power game for Eastern European power struggles was actually a game of power between Germany, Austria, and Russia. Turn back the clock another 100 years, and the predominant power in Eastern Europe was Poland. So maybe Russia should bow before its historically legitimate overlords in Warsaw. Turn back the clock another 100 years, and Sweden was a great power of Eastern Europe, vying for power with Poland. Turn back the clock another 100 years, and the Ottomans were the great power trying to cement their claim over Eastern Europe. Turn the clock back another 200 years, and the predominant power of Eastern Europe were the Duchy of Lithuania and the Mongol Golden Horde. Another 200 years, and you end up with the Kievan Rus, which is the ancestral state of modern Slavic culture. And if you were to even go further back from there, you end up with Huns, who were also Turkic, then the Goths, who were Germanic, and eventually the Sarmatians and Scythians, who are ancestral peoples of the modern Iranians. If history really is the judge here, then the Iranians have just as much of a legitimate claim than anyone else. Although the Soviet Union was the only imperial entity to unify the entirety of Eastern Europe, it only lasted 70 years. And Russia, or the lands we know as its western core, was throughout much of history a bunch of isolated backwaters, border fortresses, and outposts from where the Kievan Rus, Vikings, and Poles bought the pelts that were sold to the Ottomans.
I feel like what Kraut is saying here actually supports realism accidentally, right? Because what he's saying is they're trying and failing to create idealistic justifications for their state, and nevertheless their state persists because they are pursuing their own self-interest and power, right?
I think what he's sort of drawing attention to is not that, a powerful state can maintain itself regardless of the idea, but that it doesn't seem to be a consistent ideological justification for that beyond power. Yeah. I guess a realist could say, oh, well, that's all the justification we need.
Yeah.
But I feel like that...
it aligns exactly with the principles that were stated at the beginning. The three, the first one was that people are self-interested and act, with respect to their own power standing internationally, right? And it seems like
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like this is just descriptively what Russia is doing, right?
I think it's a question of being valid, or no, actually, no, it's not a question of being valid versus being sound. I think it's a problem. I think that is an okay I think that's like a valid, not necessarily sound idea position, but that doesn't seem to necessarily be the position that's always taken with real examples. It seems like nations are always looking for some reason to justify themselves. Like, for example, the history of China, China using maps. So I guess I think what Kraut is saying, to be more fair, is a much more narrow criticism of people who attempt to justify nations under realism with some sort of bullshit historical analysis. And I guess, to be very charitable, to do a lot of work for Kraut, you could say something like an ideology that constantly needs sort of bullshit external justifications seems to be a bad one. But to be fair, that's doing a lot of work for Kraut. Whereas I think more realistically, Kraut's just saying all these realist countries are full of all this oxymoronic, or shouldn't say oxymoronic, just incorrect assertions for why they deserve to be a great power. Very few people are viewing it as we just happen to be a great power, and more like, oh, it was always our destiny, or it's always important for us to be a great power. And to be fair, that's actually very true in particular of China, with the way that they teach the 100 years of the century of humiliation, and the idea that their rise to power now is just a return to what had been the steady state of the world before the Opium Wars and all the sort of Western domination of China.
Okay, so let me revisit something I said a couple of minutes ago, and I'm not sure if I'm right to reframe it this way, but I'll reframe it this way anyway, just to see what we think of it. Okay, so what I was saying a minute ago was, it appears to me that he's just pointing out examples of these nations trying and failing to produce ideological justification for their existence. But if I rephrase that, maybe he's saying that they're actually not failing by doing that. The fact that they even feel any need to produce such an ideological logical justification is evidence that ideology matters to people, and that even if, and the fact that the ideology doesn't hold up to scrutiny but nevertheless succeeds at propping up the state is actually evidence for that, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure if Kraut's saying exactly that, but I think that could be like a further conclusion to this point. I think most realistically, Kraut is just sort of saying all the reasons you're giving for why you ought to be the poker player are bullshit.
Yeah, and I think I pretty much have to agree with him on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is that really a substantive criticism of the, not ideology, but of the view of realism, or is it as much a criticism of like some coping done by people who happen to partake in realism, but not coping that actually is fundamentally corrosive to the core logic of realism?
Yeah, I think it might be like it might be a meaningful critique of like a subset of realists, like
that's probably a good way to put it.
Yeah, like there are some realists who want to apply realism in a certain way where they say these are the great powers for without adequate justification for saying why that these are the ones, and these other countries are poker chips without adequate justification for saying why why everyone plays the role that they do, and it's a critique of the difficulty of you know what, in this sense maybe it is just like a more holistic critique of realism, because I think no matter how you assign which are the great powers and which are the poker trips, it's always going to come down to some relatively arbitrary justification of which ones are which.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I think that is what he's getting at. Because the question would be, what if people disagreed about what ought to be a great power? Like, for example, France sometimes does with Galston that we talked about. Or another great example, in the modern context, would be Turkey. I think there's a lot of, like, uncertainty about where Turkey feels very much like it should be an important player in the world. Like, they should get to decide whether or not Sweden gets to join NATO, stuff like that. Whereas other countries don't feel that way. They should or shouldn't be a part of the EU. So actually, no, yeah, I think that's the... I think the critique, and I don't think this is actually doing that much work for Kraut, and I think this is the most Steelman statement of it, would be, in order for realism to function, you have to know who the players are and who the chips are, and there's no consistent way to make that determination.
Yeah, exactly. So when he was talking about the EU earlier, he was saying like a lot of realists are very anti-EU and don't want to count them as a great power. But then you could imagine there's a different realist who's pro-EU and thinks that the EU is a great power and should be counted as one. And both of these are equally arbitrary, and there's no really good way to decide which of them is right.
It gets back to the game theory thing we talked about, which is that people need to if people are going to play a set of rules, they need to understand the rules. Maybe not have a perfect one-to-one understanding, but, if two people are playing different sets of rules, that doesn't work, right? So there needs to be a significant amount of overlap at a minimum, if not, almost entire overlap. And if there's a big disagreement about who the who are the chips and who are the players, that's a really big problem. So actually, no, this actually does feel a lot more substantive than I think we first gave it credit for. It's just sort of being worded in a weird way. Or maybe we're about to play this and he's going to go, and what this all really gets down to is that there's no consistent way to determine who the chip is playing.
Yeah, let's see if we pre-watched
started
again.
out as a small fortress ruled by a robber baron. A robber baron, by the way, is not an insult, and it is not meant here in the 19th century definition of an industrial oligarch, but a historical term for a type of feudal lord of the Middle Ages. Feudal lords who did not rule over any valuable resources tended to raid the lands of their neighboring lords, or extract tribute from them by threatening violence. And the Prince of Muscovy, who basically ruled over a small backwater fortress...
I think barons who did have a lot of resources still did that.
Baron. Any historian will tell you that using a superficial reading
monarchy was based.
Foundational claim of modern political power is a bad idea. It will always lead you to places that prove you wrong. By standards of historical claims, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Austria, Germany, Mongolia, Turkey, and also Sweden all have just as legitimate a claim to being the predominant power of Eastern Europe. Because all of them engaged in policies of conquest and the expansion of spheres of influence to attain that status of empire. History is not a standard by which one can justify claims to empire. History is full of empires that faded into nothing. If history teaches us anything in regard to empire, it is that empire dies. There's a Chechen proverb which claims that the mountains of the
history teaches us that all the non-Russian
from the bones of Persians, Greeks, Romans, Goths, Huns, Sarmatians, Arabs, Tatars, Mongols, Turks, and Russians. And it is because of that recorded history of rising and falling empires and all the suffering and misery that came with it that Europe no longer wishes to have any empires or any great powers. But most importantly, it is also why Europe no longer wishes to have any wars. I believe many who are not from Europe often face.
Okay, I think this is maybe a little bit implausible, what he just said, that Europe no longer wishes to have any great powers or any wars, because it seems like the whole idea of the EU is for them to collectively become a great power so that they can compete on the international stage.
Yeah, I think what he means is internally, like in contrast to the idea of the concert of Europe. There isn't an eternal desire for France to, dominate Germany or Germany to dominate France or I think that's what he's trying to say.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Able to understand this point. The creation of the European Union, the idea of a European cooperation, then competition, is meant as a process to overcome a history of European empires and to build something new in its stead that provides a sharing of resources without having to forcefully construct any spheres of influence. It is precisely for this reason that everyone in Europe, including those outside of the European Union, object and stand in opposition to Russia's invasion of a European country. This is a continent drenched in centuries of blood, and nobody here wants to see a return to European bloodshed. Many non-Europeans were surprised by
if nobody did, then nobody would be invading Ukraine.
Europeans rallied behind Ukraine. We usually tend to be far less hawkish, so it does not surprise me that this hawkish European response to Russia may surprise a lot of North Americans, South Americans, Asians, and Africans. A big reason for a visceral reaction to Russia's invasion is because Russia opened up the specter of something we believe to be long gone and the horror of a distant past, the prospect of a return of European empires. Fifth, the curse of Bismarck. The way I was introduced to realism was ironically through Bismarck. Realists admire Bismarck, and this is something that strikes me as a bit of weird. There's a modern phenomenon, in particular among English speakers, to idolize Bismarck. You may have seen YouTube videos by history YouTubers from the UK or North America who uncritically idolize Bismarck, or you may have even read English-speaking historians who write of him with a degree of praise. This is weird to me and curious because in Germany, the exact opposite is happening. German historians used to write in glowing praise of Bismarck right up to the 1980s. But the common consensus among German-speaking historians today is that Bismarck was a disaster for us. The consequences of Bismarck have been a catastrophe for Germany, for Europe, and for the world. And I agree with this assessment. Bismarck violently ended a German political tradition of negotiation, compromise, and regional autonomy. In its stead, he forced an authoritarian Prussian militarism and its militaristic institutions upon Germany as its political core foundation. His policies of discrimination against the Poles planted seeds for ever deeper resentments. And the foundational myth he created for a unified German state was one conditioned on a vengeful humiliation of France, built on a militaristic identity of the Germans as history's eternal enemies of the French people. I do not understand how realists separate Bismarck from Kaiser Wilhelm, or portray Kaiser Wilhelm as the man who ruined what Bismarck built, because the catastrophic decisions that Wilhelm made were enabled by Bismarck in the first place. Bismarck paved the road into the First World War that Kaiser Wilhelm then marched down. I know military...
I don't think it makes much sense to say, I don't understand how people can separate these two, right? It's sort of like, if I build the Jenga tower and then you knock it down, you could be like, but what you did was enabled by what I did, so we're the same. Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That just the very last thing he said.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a descriptive question of, like, is it the case that, like, you, like, drenched a house in gasoline and then acted surprised when it caught on fire? Because in that case, like, you are a really big enabler. Or is it the case that, like, you gave someone a car and then they drove, cross country to join ISIS? It's like, okay, that's not really on you.
Yeah, but like from the realist point of view, it makes a lot of sense why they would distinguish these things, right? It's like one of these people was really successful, at least in the short term, of building up his state in its security and its international power position, to the like he was successful at achieving the goals that he set out to do, right? Now you could say, as Kraut did, that perhaps those weren't good goals to achieve in the first place, right? I think that critique of him makes sense. But to say that he is therefore no different from the realist point of view of somebody whose rule directly, okay, I guess the Kaiser Wilhelm II, he wasn't purposely trying to destroy what Bismarck did, but from the realist point of view, I would think that he was just going to be looked at as an incompetent person who accidentally destroyed what Bismarck built, and because they have such a high regard for people's kind of diplomatic and military prowess as opposed to their ideological justification, it makes a lot of sense that these two people are different on those grounds.
Yeah, I think I see why they would want to do that, but I think that does circle back to, is that actually true? Would you assign responsibility to Bismarck? I think that has to come down to a question of, like, is it reasonable to, or is it likely to expect what Bismarck's state was created by him to lead to what Kaiser Wilhelm did. It's sort of like an argument that people make about Hitler, that a lot of Hitler's rise to power was enabled by the previous failures of the government, who consolidated a lot of power in the executive. I think you just need you need an analysis of whether or not we would expect or find it, likely that kind of government would do the things that Kaiser Wilhelm did. That's the question that we have to ask, and then we would assign Bismarck's culpability based on that, I think.
Okay, so then if I want to be charitable to what you just said, then maybe the way I could frame it is that Bismarck succeeded at what he was trying to do, but the thing he was trying to build up was fragile, right? Perhaps a Bismarck who knew better might have foreseen the thing I'm trying to build is susceptible to destruction by the incompetence of future people, and therefore maybe it isn't such a good foundation to try to build in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what Kraut's trying to say.
Okay. It's certainly not literally what he said, though, right? Because what he said literally was from the realist point of view. It doesn't make much sense to distinguish between these two people. I think it's just from Kraut's point of view, it doesn't make much sense to distinguish between these two people. But for a realist, I totally understand why they would.
Mm-hmm.
Historians have a special romantic image of Prussia, but Prussia was a disaster for everyone. I intend to eventually make a video on the political development of Germany, but just to spoil one thing in advance, look at the worst catastrophes that befell Europe over the last century. They all have their origins in Prussian militarism, in the Prussian political institutions, and in the Prussian striving, calculations, and politics of great power. The way realists separate Bismarck from Wilhelm with a simplified "that is the good one" and "that is the bad one" is just false. Historical developments tie and weave into each other. You can't just pick what you like and dislike as one would do at a salad bar. The selective realist interpretations of history are more often than not simply false. We already went through another realist idol, Metternich, and how Metternich's subduing of internal development points to another failure of realism. But there's something else too. Metternich's Congress of Vienna was supposed to enable a lasting peace in Europe through a balance of powers. Well, did it? The decades after the Vienna Congress were dominated by an Ottoman collapse and an aggressive Russian expansion into the former Ottoman Empire. We also saw the previously mentioned revolutions that occurred across Europe, driven by internal political forces. We saw the Crimean War and its struggle over power and influence in Europe. There was a hyper-aggressive Prussia that went to war with almost all its neighbors and destroyed the faulty balance of powers that Metternich had created, only to replace it with another faulty balance of powers that led into another European catastrophe. This period of balance and...
Okay, so he's going through this list of conflicts in the 1800s, and it's totally true. Like, it makes sense that like they didn't totally succeed at achieving peace through this balance of power. But I think if you were to compare that to the wars of the Napoleonic era and the 1700s and the 1600s, I am sympathetic to thinking that Metternich's era, that the era following Metternich for the next several decades, really was more peaceful than the era that came before it.
Yep.
That's all.
Peace, realists claim existed, is overblown and far more complex than they claim. And we often do not even mention how outside of Europe it drove a brutal European colonial expansion and wars throughout the world, which many realists just pretend like they never happened. Realist calculations, though, were one of the main drivers of that colonialism, especially in Africa, where many participants wanted
this is
colonialism
actually
not
a
just
good
for
point, though,
resources,
about
but
colonialism.
to undermine the power structures and ambitions of others. The supposed balance of powers and peace in Europe just led to European power players taking out their frustrations on unfortunate peoples outside of Europe. The system of power balance were exported to Africa through the Berlin Conference. They were not previously a part of Africa and were artificially established there through imperial power games by Europe over a power balance. Realists are guilty of something that every single person interpreting history, including myself, is guilty of: selection bias. Anyone who does not admit to this is lying, by the way. And it is the main challenge of all of us who interpret history to be aware of this and to not ignore the historical events that challenge our narratives of interpretation. These were my points of criticism on realism. Feel free to voice your disagreements in the comments. And now at the end of this video, I'd like to share an alternative perspective on the origins of the war in Ukraine, the perspective of internal development. As mentioned before, I come from an almost completely opposing perspective to realism, so it probably does not come as a surprise to you that I disagree with it. Not only am I an idealist, but from my perspective, internal development is the most important factor in political development, and a determining factor also driving geopolitics. As such, I believe that this war was mainly driven by internal forces. When I look at Ukraine, I do not simply see a poker chip that merely exists to be played with by greater powers at their leisure, just as little as Vietnam or Afghanistan were poker chips. As much as you may wish to see Ukraine as just a poker chip, it will refuse to be such, and consequently also refuse to be played as such in any hypothetical game of great powers. I do not believe that the origins of this conflict lie within notions of great power or spheres of influence. I believe the origins of this conflict lie within the internal political and economic developments of institutions in a post-Soviet Europe. As such, I believe the story of this conflict begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the death of communism. The collapse of the Soviet bloc saw winners and losers. One of its winners was the Czech Republic. What sets Czechia apart from other former Eastern Bloc countries is that the 90s were dominated by a police crackdown on organized crime and white-collar crime. Czech viewers will probably know that Czechia was attempted to be used as a base by Russian organized crime to facilitate illegal business in Western Europe, most famously through the Russian mafia boss Semyon Mogilevich, who previously operated in Budapest and tried to set up shop in Czechia after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The Czechs, in response, cracked down on and expelled these crime syndicates. And this often overlooked policy measure had an enormous impact and separated the Czechs from other former Eastern Bloc countries, because it prevented the establishment of an oligarchy gaining a Russian-style political influence through its wealth. These Czech anti-white-collar crime policies may have initially been intended to crack down on Russian organized crime, but were also in the end used to crack down on oligarchic structures in general. They therefore had the wider effect of purging Czech institutions of corruption. There are still some figures in Czechia that one could call oligarchs, or kind of oligarchs, such as Andrej Babiš, a Czech business owner who during the communist regime was a spy against anti-communist dissidents, and after communism built a business empire by acquiring a former communist agricultural and chemistry company, Agrofert, and from there expanded to become influential as a right-wing populist political figure. But compared to other Eastern European oligarchs, his power is very limited. He mainly went into politics to save himself and his wealth from ongoing corruption investigations into his various business dealings, rather than to acquire more power. The Czechs, then, without a post-Soviet oligarchy controlling the economy and influencing politics, set out to build open economic and political institutions and managed to build an economic structure that enabled educated professionals and independent entrepreneurs, while also building a functioning, free representative republic that guarantees the liberties of its citizens with separation of powers under rule of law. Prague is seen today as one of the leading cities of the emerging European tech industry, rather than just some shabby corner of Eastern Europe. In fact, the Czechs are increasingly seen as a leading innovator of Europe, and have even overtaken Western European countries in modernization and development. In contrast, one of the post-Soviet collapse's biggest losers was Hungary. In Hungary, corruption and white-collar crime festered deep into the economy and state, thereby creating a system of clientistic favoritism in political institutions. The economy is run by a handful of oligarchs whose wealth is based not so much on entrepreneurship as on favoritism and backroom deals with the state. As an example, the aforementioned Russian mafia boss Simon Moglevich was able to continue his business in Budapest during the late 1990s, after being unable to run his crime syndicate in Czechia. In Budapest, he ran human trafficking, illegal prostitution, and finance scam rackets until he had to leave Hungary due to getting the attention of the FBI. Accomplices of Moglevich, like Alexei Lugokov, were able to continue operating in Hungary after Moglevich was gone. The Hungarians built a functioning state after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the callousness with which corruption was treated allowed for an oligarchy to be rejuvenated under the rule of Viktor Orban. The state is run by an autocrat who uses the oligarchy to gain far-ranging control of national media to disguise his undermining of independent civic institutions, a system that is only kept from collapsing by European Union subsidies, which the European Union is currently debating if it should cut down. As the leading example of this system, we can use Hungary's richest man, Lőrinc Mészáros. He was a gas station fitter in the 2000s and went from that to being Hungary's richest man within just a few years. But this is not a romantic rags to riches story. Lőrinc Mészáros is a high school friend of Viktor Orban, and that is the source of his wealth. When Orban became prime minister, Mészáros opened a construction company, and his construction company proceeded to receive state contracts for building bridges, stadiums, and other public infrastructure. Lőrinc Mészáros is basically a state-subsidized billionaire created purely through insipid nepotism. Among the winners and losers of the Soviet collapse, Russia and Ukraine both initially fell into the same loser traps. The Soviet-era industries were seized by ruthless and often criminal Soviet-era bureaucrats, who used these to create a clientistic system of favoritism with the state. Throughout the 90s, politics in both Ukraine and Russia was mainly the plaything of oligarchs. However, the big difference between Russian and Ukrainian political development is Putin. When Putin came to power, he managed to subdue the oligarchs in Russia and made these oligarchs subservient to the policies and demands of his newly reinforced, centralized, authoritarian Russian state. A system that is eerily similar to the Kremlinian system of Imperial Russia. But this development in the mid-2000s is where Russia and Ukraine also took different paths. What happened in Russia did not happen in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian wannabe Putins, Kuchma and his successor Viktor Yanukovych, failed at their attempts to subdue the oligarchy and build a centralized authoritarian state. Twice, in 2004 and 10 years later in 2014. Interestingly, Yanukovych was prevented from doing so not by oligarchs but by the Ukrainian public, who did not like the oligarchs but disliked the idea of a centralized authoritarian state even more. Because the establishment of a strongman authoritarianism failed in Ukraine, there's a big contrast between the political development in Russia and Ukraine. In Russia, there was a conflict between the strongman and the oligarchy, which the oligarchy lost, while the Russian public doesn't really have much of a say in politics at all, because there is no politically enfranchised public in Russia. In contrast, in Ukraine, political development, especially since 2004, has been mainly marked by a conflict between an oligarchy and the general Ukrainian public, with the authoritarian strongmen increasingly eliminated from the picture. This is not to say that Ukraine is perfect, but there is a substantial difference in political development here. Ukraine developed a politically enfranchised public. Russia does not have a politically enfranchised public. The predominant internal political struggle of Ukraine is between the public and the oligarchy. The predominant internal political struggle of Russia is between the autocrat and the oligarchy. The Putin regime sometimes refers to Ukraine as an anti-Russia, and in many ways, this is actually correct, especially if you rephrase it to Ukraine is an anti-Putin Russia. Both countries in political development made the same mistakes at the beginning of the post-Soviet era. But Russia ended up creating a strongman dictatorship, while Ukraine ended up with an enfranchised public. This is a thorn in the side of the Putin regime. I have no doubt that Putin pursues the conquest of Ukraine out of fantasies of empire as well, but I do believe that the political development of Ukraine also factors in, because Ukraine, as it currently stands, is a window for Russians where they can see what life would be like in a country that is not governed under the Putin system. I'd like to end with a final note on political developments in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, some of us unfortunately like to look down at Eastern Europe as backward, as that place that is recovering from communism. Those countries that supposedly have yet to learn to be like us in Western Europe. This is not true. In fact, I would argue that the opposite is true. Eastern Europeans are actually ahead of us in political development. Let me explain to you why I believe this. A core political struggle that we all, not just in Europe, but in democratic societies across the world, face is a confrontation between oligarchy and democracy. Neoliberal policies since the 1980s have generated huge wealth, but they also generated an enormous wealth inequality. Throughout the world's democracies, what we are increasingly seeing is the formation of small, wealthy oligarchies that increasingly challenge the political norms and institutions of liberal democracy. And Eastern Europe, well, they are ahead of us. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, an extreme neoliberal policy of shock therapy was placed upon much of the former communist bloc. In essence, to use the term from gaming, Eastern Europe did a speedrun through the process of creating an oligarchy that we in the West are only just undergoing. The development into an extreme wealth inequality and the development of tying private wealth together with political power happened faster in Eastern Europe, and in many ways Eastern Europe already underwent a development that we in the West are still to face. And once you realize this, then you will also realize that the politics of Eastern European countries is far more important than many assume at first. Figures like Putin, Yanukovych, and Orban are a warning of what can happen when oligarchy wins that struggle. Eastern Europe is not a window into a backward past. It is a window into the political struggles of our future. We should ask ourselves, facing our own struggles in wealth inequality and oligarchy, if we wish to do something more along the lines of what the Czechs did, or end up like Russia under Putin, or do something entirely different. The very political struggle that caused this war, a struggle between oligarchs, strongmen, and the public in Ukraine and Russia, will be something that we could face too. Yanukovych is not some backward Eastern tyrant who could never happen in Western Europe. No, he is a challenge we will face in our future too. And to an extent, we already do. It is eerie to me how Yanukovych's campaign manager was also the campaign manager of Trump and basically imported a post-Soviet methodology of oligarchic power politics into American politics. The reasons for this war are not to be found in Cold War era assumptions of great powers, because the future is not the past. The causes of this conflict lie in the recent past and present politics. Geopolitical conflicts are not spawned through lofty notions of international power games. In this case, they lie in the political developments that are a consequence of oligarchic challenges to public sovereignty. And if you ignore these internal developments and do not try to learn from them to avoid their consequences, you will doom yourself to facing that very conflict yourself at home. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to discuss this video with the community, do not forget to join our Discord server. Link is in the description. I also very appreciate it when you share my videos around with your friends or on social media with your followers. If you want to support my channel, you can do so by becoming a channel member or by becoming a
I just want to make sure he gets all the shoutouts out.
PayPal or Coffee. Links are all in the description. Since YouTube has demonetized every video I ever uploaded and I never made any ad revenue from any of them, any donation from you, no matter how little, is very appreciated. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you all soon again with another video.
Okay, so towards the end of that video, I was a little worried that he was like rambling off topic for a while. It's like he's saying all this really interesting stuff about the internal politics of Eastern Europe, but it seemed to me like I was sitting there thinking, like, what does this have to do with realism? Like, I guess the point he's making is just that international politics doesn't happen independently of the internal politics of countries, and then at the end, it seemed like that probably is the point that he was trying to make. It was.
I think it was a tangent just based off of. I think it's just a bit of a tangent going about talking about the process of political development that is happening in the examples that realism talks about, and just some thoughts he had on it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense in some ways as a critique of realism to say that that if you are going to focus entirely on international politics at the expense of the internal politics of the countries that are participating in it, then you are missing out on the feedback loop that happens between those two things, the effects that they have on each other, and therefore your predictive model is going to suffer. It's, you're just overlooking a lot of what's happening that feeds into the system you're trying to analyze.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so do you got anything else you want to say about this video before we're done? Or?
No, if anyone at home really liked this video, I highly recommend the rest of Kraut's channel. It's full of a bunch of different stuff that I think is really interesting and really good. I don't always agree with him, and it's not to say, and you shouldn't necessarily take his videos as the unbridled truth. I mean, hopefully you're not doing that with any YouTuber.
Yeah.
But he gets, I think, a lot closer to the mark than most people do, and I still think he gets most things right. So I would just highly recommend his channel, youtube.com, I assume /@Kraut, youtube.com/@Kraut, the underscore pair. Or if you just Google YouTube Kraut, I'm sure you'll find him.
Yeah, and that little bird cartoon character that kept showing up during the video is kind of and there it is on screen right there. Yep. That's kind of his little icon. So if you ever see that, you've found the right channel. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and I'm gonna raid out in just a moment, and see you next week.